Chapter 8 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 8. George Sand, the Hopelessly Ugly Siren. A very famous woman discovered once that men are not paragons of fidelity. Or, finding that one man was not, she decided that all men were alike. And to Jules Sandeau, who had deceived her, she exclaimed in fine melodrama frenzy, "My heart is a grave!" "From the number of its occupants," drawled Sandeau, "I should rather call it a cemetery." The woman, too angry to grasp the meaning of the ungallant speech, raged on. "But I will be avenged. I shall write the tragedy of my love in romance form, and—" "Why not in city directory form?" suggested the man, and the loverly conversation ended in hysterics. The woman was Amandine Lucille Aurore Dupin Dudevant. History, literature, and the annals of superwomen know her as George Sand. As one may glean from her verbal tilt with Sandeau, she was not a recluse or a misanthropist. In fact, she numbered her ardent wooers by the dozen. Her love life began at a convent school when she was little more than a child, and it endured until old age set in. Perhaps a list of its victims, as Sandeau so cruelly hinted, would have resembled a city directory. It certainly would have borne a striking likeness to a cyclopedic index of Europe's 19th century celebrities, for it embraced such immortal names as de Musset, Sandeau, Balzac, Chopin, Carlyle, Prosper Mérimée, Liszt, Dumas, and many another. So many demigods knelt at her shrine that at last she wrote, "I am sick of great men. I would far rather see them in Plutarch than in real life. In Plutarch, or in marble, or in bronze, their human side would not disgust me so." And the personality, the appearance, the Venusberg charm of this heart monopolist? One instinctively pictures a svelte form, a face that launched 1,000 ships, and all the rest of the sirenic paraphernalia that instinctively attach themselves to one's mental vision of a wholesale fracturer of hearts. Here is Balzac's description of her. It is found in a letter written to Madame Hanska in 1838, when George Sand was at the acme of her superwoman career. "I found her in her dressing gown, smoking an after-dinner cigar, beside the fire in an immense room. She wore very pretty yellow slippers with fringes, coquettish stockings, and red trousers. Physically, she has acquired a double chin, like a well-fed priest. She has not a single white hair, in spite of her terrible misfortunes. Her beautiful eyes are as sparkling as ever. When she is sunk in thought, she looks just as stupid as formerly, as I told her, for her expression lies wholly in her eyes. She goes to bed at 6 in the morning and rises at noon. I go to bed at 6 in the evening and rise at midnight, but, of course, I am conforming myself to her habits. She smokes to excess and plays, perhaps, too much the grande dame." Carlyle, still less merciful, snarls forth the following wholly Carlylean epitome of George Sand's looks: "She has the face of a horse." Another contemporary writer declares, "Her hair is as black and shiny as ebony. Her swarthy face is red and heavy. Her expression fierce and defiant, yet dull." So much for the verity of traditional siren dreams. So much, too, for the theory that beauty or daintiness or femininity has anything to do with the nameless charm of the world's superwomen. George Sand came honestly, if left-handedly, by her cardiac prowess. For she was a great-great-granddaughter of Adrienne Lecouvreur and Marshall Saxe, two of history's stellar heartbreakers, a fact of which she made much. Her father was a French army officer, Lieutenant Dupin, and as a mere baby his only daughter Aurore was acclaimed Daughter of the Regiment. Decked out in a tiny uniform, the ugly duckling ran wild in the army posts where her father was stationed, and joined right boisterously in the soldiers' rough sports. Later she was sent to a convent. From her own description of this particular retreat, it was a place that crushed out all normal and childish ideas and filled the growing mind with a morbid melancholy. Yet it was there that love first found the girl. The victim, or victor, was one Stéphane de Grandseine, professor of physiology. Under his tuition, she developed a queer craving for dissection, a fad she followed in psychic form through life. The love scenes between herself and her adored professor were usually enacted while they were together, dissecting a leg or an arm, or probing the mysteries of retina and cornea. It was a semi-gruesome, unromantic episode, and it ended with suddenness when the pupil was sent out into the world. There a husband was found for her. He was Casimir Dudevant, a man she liked well enough and who was mildly fond of her. They lived together for a time in modified content. 2 children were born to them. By and by Casimir took to drink. Many people refused to blame him. Indeed, there are present-day students of George Sand's life who can find a host of excuses for his bibulous failings. But once, coming home from a spree, Casimir forgot to take his wife's lofty reproaches with his wonted good nature. In a flash of drunken anger, he struck her, and she left him. The high spirit of her active independence is marred just a little by the fact that she chanced to be in love with another man. This other man was Aurélien de Sèze, a ponderous country magistrate. The affair was brief. Presently the two had parted, and George Sand, penniless, went to Paris to make a living by literature. She obtained hack work of a sort, lived in the typical draughty garret so dear to unrecognized genius, and earned for a time only 15 francs ($3) a month. It was the customary nadir, wherein one gathers equipment for success. Then she met Jules Sandeau. He was a lawyer who dabbled in literature. He fell in love with the lonely woman, and she with him. They formed a literary partnership. Together they wrote novels and began to achieve a certain measure of good luck. Their novels were signed George Sand. Why, no one knows. It was a pen name devised by the feminine member of the novelistic firm. But before long, Sandeau was left far behind in the race for fame. His more or less fair partner wrote a novel on her own account. It was Indiana. Like Byron, she woke one morning to find herself famous. The book had lifted her forever out of obscurity and need. At about the same period, she entered Sandow's study one day just in time to see him kiss another woman. The other woman chanced to be their laundress, who, presumably, was more kissable, if less inspiring, than was the newly acclaimed celebrity on whom Sandeau had been lavishing his fickle affections. There was a scene unequaled for violence in any of their joint novels, and in the course of it occurred the repartee recorded at the beginning of this story. As an upshot, Sandeau followed Dudevant, de Sèze, Grandseine, and the rest into the limbo of George Sand's discarded lovers, where he was soon to be joined by many another and far greater man. Her faith in men shattered for at least the fourth time, George Sand forswore fidelity and resolved to make others suffer, even as she liked to imagine she herself had suffered. The literary world was, by this time, cheering itself hoarse over her, and literary giants were vying for her love. Out of the swarm, she selected Prosper Mérimée. The author of Carmen was then in his prime as a lion of the salons. To him, George Sand gave her heart irrevocably and forever. Through youth and maturity, they worshipped each other for 8 consecutive days. On the 9th day, George Sand informed Carmen's creator that he was far too cynical to be her ideal any longer. Mérimée retorted that her pose of divine exaltation was better suited to an angel than to an ugly woman who continually smoked cigars, and who swore as pyrotechnically as one of her father's most loquacious troopers. So the romance ended. Followed a bevy of loves well nigh as brief, most of whose heroes' names are emblazoned on the book backs of the world's libraries. And after this populous interregnum came Alfred de Musset. De Musset was a mere boy, but his wonderful poetry had already awakened Europe to ecstasy. He was the beau ideal of a million youthful lovers and their sweethearts, even as a generation earlier Byron had been. It was in 1833 that he and George Sand met. De Musset had seen her from afar and had begged for an introduction. She was 6 years older than he, and the prettiest girls in France were pleading wistfully for his smile. But at sight he loved the horse-faced, almost middle-aged swearer of strange oaths and smoker of strong cigars. Hence his plea to be introduced. Sainte-Beuve, to whom he made the request, wrote asking leave to bring him to one of George Sand's at-homes. The same day she returned a most positive refusal, writing, "I do not want you to introduce de Musset to me. He is a fop, and we would not suit each other. Instead, bring Dumas, in whose art I have found a soul, if only the soul of a commercial traveler." But de Musset, unrebuffed, succeeded in his ambition. He managed to secure an introduction to her at a banquet given by the Revue des Deux Mondes editors, and almost at once his love was reciprocated. Then began a union that was alternately the interest, the scandal, and the laughing-stock of a continent. Each of the lovers was a genius. Each had been pedestaled by the world. Each was supposed to live on a rarefied plane far above the heads or the ken of mere earth folk. The love affair of two such immortals might reasonably be expected, was expected, to be akin to the noble romances of poetry. As a matter of fact, its 3-year course was one long series of babyish spats, of ridiculous scenes, and of behavior worthier the inmates of a madhouse or a kindergarten than of the decade's 2 master intellects. George Sand expected de Musset to live on the heights of bloodless idealism. When he did so, she berated him as heartless. When he failed to, she denounced him as an animal. She was never content with whatever course he might follow. Yet she was madly in love with him. During their brief separations, she avalanched him with letters, some furious, some imploring, some wildly affectionate, some drearily commonplace. Here is an extract from one, displaying a fair sample of her warmer moods. "It is nothing to you to have tamed the pride of such a woman as I, and to have stretched me a suppliant at your feet. It is nothing to you that I am dying of love? Torment of my life that you are!" In the course of the cranky affair, They journeyed to Italy. There, in turn, both fell ill. And there, through the medium of the sick room, both met a handsome young Italian doctor, Pietro Pagello, who, by the way, was still living a very few years ago, at the age of 90. Pagello's dark good looks and his vivacity temporarily swept George Sand's heart far out of poor convalescent de Musset's reach. She became blindly infatuated with the young doctor. De Musset, jealously sick and sickly jealous, was quick to see how matters stood, and with true Gallic sensationalism he rose to the dramatic occasion. First, he swore eternal brotherhood and loyalty to the doctor, whom he scarcely knew, and then, joining the embarrassed Pagello's hand to George Sand's, the poet tearfully declaimed, "I know all. You love each other. Take him, Aurore, as the parting gift of a lover you have ceased to love. Take her, Pietro, as a memento of your sworn friend. Adieu, both of you, forever." De Musset strode from the room in a style that would have evoked an applause storm from even a deaf and dumb gallery. He left Italy and came back to France. There he loudly bewailed his fate and moaned rhythmically anent the false flame of woman's love. Meanwhile, George Sand found to her surprise that she loved the dramatic de Musset far more than she loved Pagello. She followed de Musset to Paris, bringing Pagello along for good measure. When she had gone to Italy with de Musset, Paris had gasped. Even the usual latitude allowed to geniuses had been perilously stretched. When de Musset had returned, Orpheus-like, weeping all over the strings of his lyre, Paris had wept with him. But now that the heroine of the escapade followed in full chase of the discarded one, dragging his successor in her wake, Paris howled with inextinguishable laughter. De Musset, poetically sensitive to every change of opinion, refused to make himself ridiculous. While renewing his vow of brotherly friendship for Pagello, he utterly refused to see George Sand, or to answer one of her 1,000 beseeching letters. Pagello, too, began to feel supremely uncomfortable in his thankless role of excess baggage. He squirmed nervously in search of a door of escape. He quickly found one. "Monsieur de Musset must hate me for what I have done," he announced to all who would stop laughing long enough to listen to him. "He has probably sworn a blood feud against me. I will not remain here to become the victim of a vendetta." And he fled incontinently to his native Italy, leaving George Sand alone to face the now redoubled spasms of public mirth. Tragically humorless, deaf to snicker and guffaw, she set herself to the tedious task of winning back de Musset. When letters were of no avail, she sought to waylay him in the street or elsewhere. Forewarned, he kept to his rooms. Then she stationed herself on his doorstep, and wept there like a modern and uglier Niobe, for all to see. De Musset kept still closer hidden from view. In desperation, the unhappy woman resolved to follow the historic example of Ninon de l'Enclos in reclaiming an errant lover. She cut off her heavy black hair, her one beauty, and sent it by messenger to the coy de Musset. The sacrifice was vain. Perhaps the beauty-loving poet, remembering how homely she had looked even with her luxuriant hair, drew a vivid mind-picture of what she must look like without it. At all events, he made no sign of forgiveness. One day, de Musset, coming unguardedly out of his apartment, collided on the stairs with the weeping woman. There was a partial and very temporary reconciliation, followed soon by a permanent break. George Sand, tingling with hurt pride, proceeded to write a novel wherein, under a painfully thin and open-work veil, she told the story of her love affair with de Musset. It is waste of space to add that she told it from her own angle, depicting herself as a gentle, too loving martyr, and painting de Musset as a false, affected, ludicrously worthless personage. The novel set Paris to jabbering as noisily as it had just laughed. De Musset was regarded as a monster, a monument of duplicity, and his former sweetheart as a patient saint. But the poet was not long in preparing a counterblast. Promptly he threw into the arena a book in which, under still thinner disguise, he gave his own version of the story. In this volume, de Musset was a trusting lover and George Sand a viper. There were further recriminations, in print and out of it. Literary Paris was divided into two camps. Between the pro-Mussets and the pro-Sands, the war raged merrily. Swinburne crystallized the case in a deathless epigram. De Musset was wrong, but George did not behave as a gentleman should. For a time, George Sand turned to her work for oblivion. She wrote 8 hours a day. Her novels were among the foremost of the century. She was France's best-known woman. The men who had loved her served now as characters for her books, as had de Musset. Mercilessly she dissected them, memories of the physiology professor, and held up to scorn their faults, their frailties, their crass humanness. There was gnashing of teeth. There was recognition, wholesale. There was protest. There were legions of threats to prosecute. Said merry old Abbe Liszt, himself a heart-conqueror of renown, "Each of your admirers, madame, is a butterfly which you lure to you by honey, impale upon the pin of jealousy or boredom, and finally vivisect in a novel." After a mere breathing space came what was probably the grand passion of George Sand's ultra-passionate life, a romance with none of the ironic humor that lighted her affair with de Musset. The hero, victim, what you will, was Frédéric Chopin, too fiery soul in too fragile body. Genius, wonder musician, dreamer, the man had always been tossed on misfortune's waters, hammered by them till his mighty soul had well nigh torn free from the failing flesh. And at this period, of all others, fate threw him into the life of George Sand. He was slender, weak, almost effeminate in his unfleshliness. She was brutally robust, mannish, aggressive, his exact opposite. And they loved more deeply, more all-absorbingly than either had loved before, in a mutually long era of heart-destroying. In fact, George Sand loved Chopin as she loved nothing else on earth, with the sole exception of her idolized self. The hand of death was already on Chopin when he and George Sand met. This supervital woman seemed to breathe into him some of her own tireless vitality. His health rallied. It was said by fanciful acquaintances that George Sand's life was keeping life in her lover. She heard and was glad, and hastened to proclaim the wonder to her friends, adding thereby a leaf to her martyr crown. By sheer willpower and excess vital force, she actually buoyed up her frail lover's sinking strength and gave him a new lease of living. This did not prevent her from quarreling fiercely and frequently with him, as she always did with every man or woman who came into personal acquaintance with her. Chopin begged her to marry him. She refused. One venture in matrimony had sufficed her, not even to make happy the man she loved, would she essay a second trial of wedlock. In her first onrush of devotion for Chopin, she could not blind herself to the fact that, even as she had tired of others, so she might one day tire of him, and divorces in France were not easy to get. Hence, the dying Chopin's supreme wish went ungratified, as had many a lesser wish during his affair with her. The sick composer had known many loves, yet from the hour he met George Sand he seems to have been steadfast to that single devotion. It is not on record that he so much as aroused her ever-wakeful jealousy, and he is probably the only man of her love-starred career who did not, which is odd, in view of this assertion by one of Chopin's biographers. He found himself unable to avoid accepting some of the numberless hearts that were flung like roses at his feet. He could modulate from one love affair to another as fleetly and as gracefully as from one key to its remote neighbor. Here, too, is the account given by a later chronicler of the composer's meeting with George Sand. One evening, as he was entering a house where a literary reception was in progress, Chopin fancied he was pursued by a violet-scented phantom. In superstitious fear, he would have left the house at once, but friends who were with him laughed away his dread, and described the phenomenon as the fancy of a sick man's brain. He entered the crowded salon, and was forthwith presented to the guest of honor, a swarthy and strange-looking woman, the premier novelist, Madame Dudevant, George Sand. In his diary that same night, Chopin wrote of his new acquaintance, "I do not like her face. There is something in it that repels me." Yet within a day or so he was her adorer. For a time all went as well as any love story could with such a heroine. She gloried in her power to build up for the moment her lover's waning strength. Her friends' praise of the feat was as music to her. But she was not the type of woman who can forever wait patiently upon a fretful convalescent's whims. Her self-sacrifice was a flash, not a steady flame. And in time she girded at the restraints of playing nurse and vitality-giver. Then, instead of boasting as before, she waxed complaining. She told the world at large how exacting and cross and tiresome Chopin was. She once referred to him publicly as "that detestable invalid." She announced that she was his ever-patient comrade and nurse. There is no authority but hers to bear out the claim of patience. And so the once beautiful relationship dragged out its weary length until George Sand could endure the strain no longer. She deserted Chopin. Not content with this final blow to the invalid who had loved her for years, she continued to vilify him. Among her complaints was one that has since passed in slightly altered form into a good old reliable vaudeville wheeze. She wrote, "We never addressed a single reproach to each other except once, and that was from the first to the last time we met." George Sand's desertion was Chopin's death-blow. He never rallied from it. He tried to mask his heartbreak by going about as before and appearing often in public, but even this was soon denied to him, not only by collapsed health, but from the danger of meeting his former divinity at the houses he chanced to visit or on the streets. One such lesson was enough for him. It was in a friend's crowded drawing-room. A historian describes the encounter. Thinking herself unobserved, George Sand walked up to Chopin and held out her hand. "Frederick," she murmured, in a voice audible to him alone. He saw her familiar form standing before him. She was repentant, subdued, and seeking reconciliation. His handsome face grew deadly pale, and without a word he left the room. The end came soon afterward. Chopin's mortal illness struck him down. Dying, he sent for his lost love. Perhaps the message never reached her. Perhaps she thought it a trick. She had tried something of the sort on de Musset. Perhaps she did not realize that the time was so short. At all events, she paid no heed to the frantic appeal that she come at once to the dying composer. Hour after hour, Chopin waited for her, his ears strained for the sound of her heavy tread. At last, he grew to realize that she would not obey the summons, that he would never again see her. As hope fled, Chopin broke down and cried piteously. "She promised I should die in no arms but hers," he sobbed over and over. And that night he died, no less than 7 different women claiming later to have taken his recreant sweetheart's place at his deathbed. George Sand was conscience-stricken. She wrote and proclaimed long and more or less plausible reasons to account for her failure to go to Chopin. But no one who really knew her was convinced of her excuses' truth, and so ended one more of her heart stories. De Musset, by the way, refused to admit her to his rooms when he himself lay dying, a grisly joke that Paris appreciated. Back to her work, as once before, George Sand fled for forgetfulness, and her fame grew. She was the most prolific woman writer, by the way, in literature's history, writing in all 20 plays and more than 100 novels. An Englishman, name buried, courted her at about this time. Still miserable over Chopin's death, and far more so over the way people were talking about her treatment of him, she was decidedly waspish to the trans-Channel admirer. Seeking to win her interest in a literary discussion, he opened one conversation by inquiring, "Madame Dudevant, what is your favorite novel?" "Olympia," she answered without a second of hesitance. "Olympia?" the Englishman repeated, vainly ransacking his memory. "I don't think I recall any book of that name." "Of course you don't," she snapped. "I haven't written it yet." And perhaps, or perhaps not, his British brain some day unraveled the meaning of cryptic retort. For her infidelities, George Sand felt no compunction. She wrote frankly concerning them. "I have never imposed constancy upon myself. When I have felt that love is dead, I have said so without shame or remorse, and have obeyed Providence that was leading me elsewhere." By her marriage with Dudevant, she had had a son and a daughter. The daughter, Solange, inherited much of her mother's lawlessness, with none of the latter's inspiration. And now George Sand was to see how her own nature worked in another of the same blood. She arranged a splendid marriage for Solange, a marriage with a man of rank and money. And on the very eve of the wedding, Solange proceeded to elope with a poor sculptor, Clesinger by name. The mother was equal to the emergency. She ran after the fugitives, caught them, bullied Clesinger into marrying Solange, hushed all scandal, and installed the young couple in a Paris flat, settling on them the bulk of her property. In revenge, Clesinger permanently estranged Solange from her mother. Soon afterward, George Sand's sway over men's hearts ceased. Whether she was weary of love, or whether love was weary of her, the old fascination deserted her. No more as lovers, but as profound admirers of her intellect, great men still flocked about her: Matthew Arnold, Flaubert, Fouillé, and a host of others, but it was now her brain alone they worshipped. By many years George Sand outlived her charm, dying in 1876 at the age of 72, her grandchildren about her, a smugly proper, if sadly anticlimacteric, ending to a career in which anticlimax had been almost as infrequent as propriety. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Linda Johnson.
Chapter 9 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 9. Madame du Barry, the $7 million siren. She came from the same neighborhood that had produced Joan of Arc. She even claimed relationship to the long-dead maid. But at that point all likeness between the two comes to a very abrupt end. She is known to history as Marie Jeanne Gomard de Vaubernier, Comtesse du Barry. The parish register of her birthplace describes her less flamboyantly as Marie Jeanne, natural daughter of Anne Bécu, known as Quantigny, born August A.D. 1746. There are many details in Marie Jeanne du Barry's story that I am going to omit, at my own request, not only because they are unwritable, but because their sordid vulgarity is also drearily stupid. I apologize in advance for the omissions, but even after the process of weeding out, I think there will be quite enough left to hold the interest. When Marie was 6, Anne Bécu drifted to Paris, the Mecca of her trade, and soon afterward an admirer of Anne's, one Dumonceau, was coaxed into lavishing $2.40 a month on Marie's education. Dumonceau had been one of Anne's wooers in the village days, and it has been suggested that his interest in little Marie was prompted by more than mere kindness, in fact, that he and the infant were more than kin and less than kind. In any case, the monthly $2.40 paid Marie's expenses in a convent school, where she spent the next 10 years. This Sainte Aurore convent, in the Rue Neuve Sainte Geneviève, was a philanthropic refuge for all young persons of honest parentage who are in circumstances where they run the risk of ruin. The rules of the Sainte Aurore were far stricter and icier than those of the most investigable of modern orphanages. Among the punishments inflicted on these little wards of God were starvation, beatings, and imprisonment in cold and stone-floored dark cells, for the very mildest transgressions. 3 dire sins, calling always for instant retribution, were to laugh, to sing, and to speak above a whisper. For such hideous and unnatural crimes as laughter, song, and ordinary speech, these poor loveless babies were treated like the vilest criminals. One hopes morbidly that the theologians who abolished hell left at least one warm corner of it in commission for the framers and enforcers of those gentle rules. All the foregoing is not sentimental mush, but is mentioned to show how dire must have been a pupil's sin that the convent authorities could not cope with. And such a sin, no one knows what it was, Marie committed when she was 16, for which she was expelled in black disgrace from her happy childhood home at Sainte Aurore, and turned loose upon the world. Her mother's loving arms were open, ready to receive and succor the disgraced girl, and to start her afresh in life, as only a mother can. So, to keep Marie from feeling unduly dependent upon a poor working woman like herself, she taught her her own trade, the oldest on earth. With a little basket of cheap jewelry, which served the same purpose as a present-day beggar's stock of lead pencils, Marie went the rounds of the streets. Her career was cut out for her by her mother's fond forethought, and in 999 cases out of 1,000, a girl thus launched would have ended in the gutter. But Marie was the 1,000th woman, a true superwoman in every sense of the word. The filth of the streets could not smirch her, outwardly, and luck was waiting around the corner for her. A rich and eccentric old woman of fashion, Madame Legrade, had a craze for amateur theatricals. Catching sight of Marie one day, she was struck by the girl's beauty, and hired her, partly as a companion and partly as a comedian for her private theatre. At Madame Legrade's, Marie got her first view of semi-decent society, and, being adaptable, she picked up a smattering of manners and of grammatical speech. Only a smattering, but all she cared to acquire. There, too, she met such men as the withered old wit de Richelieu, and the Prince de Soubise, and the Duc de Brissac, whose son was one day to be the one real love of her life. Here, too, she met a genius whom she describes in her memoirs as a cunning fox, witty, very ugly, and very thin. He was Grimm, the fairy tale man. Marie was in clover, but the fortune was too good to last, and because a far more glittering fortune was awaiting her just around the corner, destiny soon joggled the girl out of her snug berth. Madame Legrade had two sons. Both of them fell crazily in love with Marie. It is not on record that she told them she would rather be the poor working girl that she was, and Madame Legrade, in horror, ordered her out of the house. Back to her dear old loving mother as before went Marie, and once more mother love came to the rescue. Anne Bécu had recently married a lackey of some great house. She was now Madame Racon. Marie adopted her stepfather's name, the first to which she had ever possessed even a semi-legal claim, and permitted her mother to get her a job in the millinery shop of Madame Labille. This shop was of a sort extremely common in that day. It sold not only hats for women, but sword knots and shoe buckles for men. It employed only girls of extreme beauty, and it was a favorite lounging place for men about town. Altogether there was no startling change in Marie's vocation from the era when she had hawked artificial jewelry. Her presence drew scores of young dandies to the shop, and she might readily have had her pick of the lot. But during a momentary weakness of intellect she plunged into a love affair with a handsome young pastry cook, Nicolas Mouthon. The other and more ambitious girls guyed her right unmercifully for her plebeian tastes, but it was terribly serious with Marie. Mouthon was the first man to whom she had lost her heart. Many years later she wrote: "When I call to memory all the men who have adored me, I must say it was not poor Nicolas who pleased me least, for I too have known what first love can mean." But she forgot what first love can mean as readily as she had learned it, for soon she threw over Nicolas for a man of wealth, named de la Vauvenardière, and she abandoned the latter for a suitor named Duval, and ousted Duval from her affection for Lamé, the court hairdresser. No, in choosing Lamé she was not lowering her standard. A court hairdresser was far more than a mere barber. He was a functionary of vast importance, the confidant of the great, the counselor of the unwary, a man of substance and position, the only tradesman in all France who was permitted by court edict to wear a sword. Marie was envied as Lamé's sweetheart, until he went broke overnight and had to flee to England to dodge a debtor's cell. Then came the Cos incident. At least, then it began. Cos, or Louis Hercule Timoleon de Cos-Brissac, was the Duc de Brissac's son. He met Marie in the street one day, so runs the story, followed her to the shop, and there, under the pretext of buying a sword knot, fell in to talk with her. He loved her at first sight, and she loved him. Theirs was not such a love as either had hitherto known. It was the genuine article. Cos was young and good-looking, and afflicted with republican ideas. He did not see in Marie the vendor of cheap jewelry and cheaper affections, nor the girl who used her millinery job as a mask. To him she was an angel, and, so far as concerned him, she was. They were young, and they dreamed. Cos was unlike any man Marie had known. His love was utterly unlike any love she had known or heard of. Altogether it was a pretty little romance on both sides, and if we smile at it, let the smile be kindly, with nothing of the leer about it, for there was nothing to provoke a leer, at least not then. This Cos affair's early stages are so intertangled with romance, legend, court rumor, and later inventions that I hasten to forestall corrections from readers wiser than I, by confessing that all I know of it, or can learn from supposedly reliable sources, is that Marie and Cosse parted somewhat suddenly, and the causes variously given are that his father put a stop to the romance, and that Cosse learned something of Marie's real character. It is gravely declared that he wanted to marry her, and that his indignant ducal parent not only opened his eyes to the bride-elect's past, but threatened to throw Cosse into the Bastille by means of a lettre de cachet. As I said, I vouch for none of these reasons for the break between the two lovers. It is all surmise, but what follows is not. The next man to lose his head and heart to Marie was a young nobleman, whose repute may be guessed from the fact that, even in dissolute 18th-century Paris, he was known not as a roué, but as the roué. He had come to Paris a few years earlier, leaving a wife somewhere on the way. He had squandered his patrimony en route and reached the capital penniless. But he quickly caught the fancy of Madame Malouse, who had influence at court. She arranged that he should have practically the sole monopoly of supplying the French navy with all its various forms of merchandise. This meant fat profits, and he fattened them still further by running a select gambling house. He was Jean, Viscount du Barry. Jean met and fell victim to Marie. Realizing what a cash attraction her beauty and charm could be made, he installed her as presiding genius of his gambling house, as a lure to draw youthful nobles to the place. Marie, or Madame Lange, as, for no known reason, she had begun to call herself, was the bright star at the chance goddess' shine, and the money poured fast into the crooked games whereby the house made Jean rich. For a time there was wholesale prosperity all around, with plenty more of it to come. Before I go on, may I quote a contemporary writer's word picture of Marie as she appeared at this time. Her hair is long, silky, curling like a child's, and blonde with a natural ash tint. Her eyebrows and lashes are dark and curly. Behind them the blue eyes, which one seldom sees quite open, look out with coquettish, sidelong glances. Her nose is small and finely cut, and her mouth is a perfect Cupid's bow. Her neck, her arms, and her feet and hands remind one of ancient Greek statuary, while her complexion is that of a rose leaf steeped in milk. She carries with her a delicious atmosphere of intoxication, victorious, amorous youth. Voltaire once exclaimed, before a portrait of her, "The original was made for the gods." Even as the cherry tree was posthumously invented for Washington, and perhaps the apple for William Tell, and the egg for Columbus, so around Marie in after years sprang up countless tales of her youth. Some may have been true, some were palpable lies. To which does the ensuing anecdote belong? In the spring of 1768, during her sojourn as come-on for the Du Barry gambling hell, Marie noticed, 3 days in succession, that she was closely followed on the street by a young man of a sober cast of countenance and elegant attire. Now, to be followed was no novelty to Marie, and more than one man of elegant attire had sued in vain for her favor. Yet this youth made no advances, he simply followed her wherever she went, and in his absence his face haunted her strangely. So, on the 4th day, as she turned suddenly in the street, and saw him close behind her, she asked, with affected indignation, "What do you want of me?" The man bowed low, with no shadow of hesitancy, made this cryptic answer to her query: "Mademoiselle, will you grant me the first reasonable request I may make of you when you are Queen of France?" Thinking he was a crank, as perhaps he was, she sought to humor him, and replied, "Certainly, monsieur, I promise." "You take me for a madman," he returned, with a second grave bow, "but I am not insane. Adieu, mademoiselle. There will be nothing more extraordinary than your elevation, except your end." He spoke and vanished, either into the street crowd or into thin air. You may recall the story of the man in black's midnight visit to Ninon de l'Enclos, with a gift for the essence of youth and the warning of her death. This was a well-believed and oft-repeated narrative in Marie's day. It is highly possible that she built from it her recital of the adventure of the elegantly attired stranger. At all events, she told Jean du Barry about it. Whether or not he believed it is no concern of yours or mine, but it assuredly gave him an idea, the supreme idea of his rotten life. He saw a 1 in 50 chance of making more money through Marie than she could have earned for him in a century as divinity of his gambling rooms. And remote as were the scheme's prospects for success, he resolved to make a gambler's cast at the venture. Louis XV, King of France, had been ruled for nearly 20 years by the Marquis de Pompadour, who had squandered royal revenues, had made and unmade men's career by a nod or a shake of her pretty head, and had played at ducks and drakes with international politics. And now Madame de Pompadour was dead. Many a younger and prettier face had caught Louis's doddering fancy since her death, but no other maîtresse en titre had ruled him and France since then. Briefly, Jean coveted the vacant office for Marie. Not for her own sake. Jean did not care for her happiness or welfare, or for the happiness or welfare of any mortal on earth except of one Jean Vicomte du Barry. But he foresaw that with Marie as the royal favorite, he himself as her sponsor, could reap a harvest such as is not the guerdon of one man in a million. He set to work at his self-appointed task with the same rare vigor and cunning that he so long enabled him to elude the hangman and to live on better men's money. The first step was to engage the help of Lebel, the king's valet de chambre. Lebel was nominally a servant, but in a sense he was mightier than any prime minister, for Louis relied inexplicably on the valet's taste in feminine beauty. It was Lebel, for instance, who had first brought Madame de Pompadour to the king's notice. He had done the same good turn to many another aspiring damsel, and now, heavily bribed by Jean du Barry, he consented to see if Marie was worth mentioning to Louis. The connoisseur valet realized to the full her superwoman charm. He recognized her as the 1000th woman, even the 1,000,000th. Yet Lebel was ever cautious about raising false hopes. So, not knowing that Jean had gone over the whole plan with Marie, he asked her if she would honor him by attending a little informal dinner he was soon to give in his apartment at the Versailles Palace, a dinner in honor of the Baron de Gonesse. Marie, with sweet innocence, accepted the invitation, then timidly asked Lebel if she might sit beside him at the dinner, as all the others would be strangers to her. The bare thought of his presuming to sit down in the presence of the king, otherwise the Baron de Gonesse, so filled Lebel with horror that he forgot his role of diplomacy and blurted out, "I sit at the table with him! I shall be unexpectedly called from the room as usual, just as dinner is served, and I shall not return until it is over." When Marie, carefully coached as to behavior, repartee, and so forth, by the ever thoughtful Jean, arrived at Lebel's apartments in the palace on the night of the dinner, she found, to her disgust, that the king was nowhere in sight, not even disguised as the Baron de Gonesse, and that her fellow guests were merely a group of Versailles officials. Not being versed in palace secrets, she did not know that Louis was seated in a dark closet behind a film-curtained window, looking into the brightly lighted dining room, and noting everything that went on, nor that cunningly arranged speaking tubes brought every whispered or loud-spoken word to him. Finding the king was not to be one of the guests, the girl philosophically choked back her chagrin, and set herself to get every atom of fun out of the evening that she could. She ate much, drank more, and behaved pretty quite like a gloriously lovely street gamin. There was no use in wasting on these understrappers the fine speeches and the courtesy she had been learning for the king's benefit. So she let herself go, and the dinner was lively, to say the very least. In fact, it was the gayest, most deliciously amusing dinner ever held in those sedate rooms, thanks to Marie. Louis, in paroxysm of laughter, looked on until the sound of his guffaws betrayed his royal presence. Then he came out of hiding. Marie, for an instant, was thunderstruck at what she had done. She feared she had ruined her chances by the boisterous gaiety of the past hour or so. Then, for her brain was as quick as her talk was dull. She saw the fight was not lost, but won, and she knew how she had won it. Louis XV was 58 years old. He lived in France's most artificial period. No one dared be natural, least of all in the presence of the king. All his life he had been treated to honeyed words, profound reverence, the most polished and adroit courtesy. People, women especially, had never dared be human when he was around. Marie saw that it was the novelty of her behavior which had aroused the king's bored interest, and from that moment her course was taken. She did not cringe at his feet, or pretend innocence, or assume grande dame airs. She was herself, Marie Becu, the slangy, light-hearted, feather-brained daughter of the streets, respecting nothing, fearing nothing, confused by nothing, as ready to shriek gutter oaths at her king as at her footman. And of course she was also Marie Becu, the Superwoman, whose magnetism and beauty were utterly irresistible. The combination was too much for Louis. He succumbed. What else was there for him to do? After the myriad poses of the women he had known, Marie's naturalness was like a bracing breeze sweeping through a hothouse. A slum breeze, if you like, but none the less a breeze, and delightfully welcome to the jaded old monarch. Louis fell in love with Marie. It was not a mere infatuation of an hour, like most of his affairs. He fell completely and foolishly in love with her, and he never fell out of love with her as long as he lived. Lebel was in despair. He had hoped Marie might amuse the king. He had had no shadow of an idea that the affair would go further. By reason of his privileges as an old servant, he actually ventured to remonstrate with Louis. "Sire," he protested, "she is not even legitimate. The birth records attest that." "Then," laughed the king, "let the right authorities make her so." Accordingly, messengers were sent post haste to her babyhood home, and a new birth certificate was drawn up, also a certificate attesting to her mother's legal marriage to a wholly mythical Monsieur de Gomard de Vaubernier, and to several other statements that made Marie's legitimacy as solid as Gibraltar. "Also," pleaded the valet, "she is neither a wife nor a woman of title." "We can arrange both those trifles," the king assured him. And with charming simplicity the thing was done. Jean sent for his worthless elder brother, Guillaume, Comte de Berry, who was at that time an army captain, and on September 1st, 1768, Marie and Guillaume were duly married. The lucky bridegroom received enough money to pay all his debts and to make him rich. Then he obligingly deserted his new-made wife at the church door, according to programme, and wandered away to spend his fortune as might best please him. Thereby Marie Becu became Madame la Comtesse du Berry, without having her cur of a husband to bother about. A list of her possessions and their values, duly set down in the marriage contract, which is still on file, shows the state of Marie's finances at this time. I copy it for the benefit of those who may be interested to learn of a useful life's by-products. At 22, in 1768, so says the contract, Marie was the sole owner of one diamond necklace worth $1,600, an aigrette and a pair of earrings in clusters worth $1,600, 30 dresses and petticoats worth $600, lace, dress trimmings, caps, etc., worth $1,200, 6 dozen shirts of fine linen, 12 complete morning dresses, and other articles of linen, etc., worth $400. One obstacle alone now barred Marie's road to supremacy. According to unbreakable royal etiquette, 3 things were indispensable to the woman who aspired to become a French king's maîtresse en titre. She must be legitimate, she must be of noble rank, and she must have been presented at court. The first 2 conditions Marie had fulfilled. The third was a poser. In order to be presented at court, some reputable woman of the old nobility must act as sponsor, and not one decent woman of high rank would sink to acting as sponsor for Marie. Moreover, the king declared he did not care whether she were presented or not, and he would take no step to help her in the matter. Without this presentation she could not appear publicly at court. She could not sway overt political influence. She could not have a suite of rooms at the palace. Between a presentation and no presentation lay all the difference between uncrowned queen and a light o' love, and no one would sponsor Marie. Jean de Berry at last solved the problem, as he had solved all the rest. He had able assistants, for a court clique had been formed to back Marie's pretensions. The clique was headed by such men as the old Duc de Richelieu and the much younger Duc d'Aiguillon. The latter was violently in love with Marie, and there is no reason to think that his love was hopeless. But the rest of the clique cared not a straw about her. To them the whole thing was a master move in politics. With Marie in control of the king, and themselves in control of Marie, they foresaw an era of unlimited power. The Duc de Choiseul, Prime Minister of France, was the sworn enemy of this clique, which formed the opposition, and Choiseul swore to move heaven and earth to prevent Marie's presentation, for he knew it would lead to his own political ruin, as it did. Jean du Barry hunted around until he discovered somewhere in Navarre a crotchety and impoverished old widow, the Dowager Comtesse de Béarn. She was a scion of the ancient nobility, the decayed and dying branch of a once mighty tree. She was not only poor to the verge of starvation, but she had a passion for lawsuits. She had just lost a suit and was on the verge of bankruptcy. The good-hearted Jean, through the clique's help, arranged to have the case reopened and the decision reversed. This was before our own day of an incorruptible judiciary. He also promised her a gift of $20,000 in gold. All this in return for the trifling service of journeying up to Paris and thence to Versailles to act as sponsor for the lovely Madame du Barry, who had wilfully declared that she would be presented under no less auspices than those of the illustrious Comtesse de Béarn. The old Comtesse accepted the offer with all the shrinking reluctance a hungry dog shows at the proffer of a bone. She came up to Paris at the expense of the clique, and was immured in Jean's house, with the gambler's sister, Fanchon du Barry, as her jailer and entertainer. Choiseul, through his spies, learned of the plot, and he tried in every way to kidnap the old lady or to outbribe the du Barrys. Meanwhile, coached by Jean, the fair Marie was making King Louis's life miserable by throwing herself at his feet, in season and out of season, and beseeching him to silence her enemies forever by allowing her to be presented. When these tactics failed, she would let loose upon the poor king a flood of gutter language, roundly abusing him, turning the air blue with her profanity, and in other ways showing her inalienable right to a place in court circles. Louis would promise nothing. The turmoil alternately bored and amused him. At last, April 21st, 1769, on his return from the hunt, after an unusually good day's sport, the king casually remarked to all concerned, "The presentation of Madame la Comtesse du Barry will occur at tomorrow evening's levee." The traditional and well-thumbed bombshell exploding among them would have created no more stir in court circles than did this yawned announcement. Choiseul and his followers were in despair. Jean ran around in circles, making preparations for the triumph. Marie rehearsed for the 100th time the complicated forms of etiquette the occasion called for. The Choiseul faction tried one thing after another to block the ceremony. They kidnapped Marie's hairdresser, stole the coach in which she was to make the trip from her Paris house to Versailles, arranged a hold-up on the road, and so forth. Thanks to Jean's wit and clique's power, a new hairdresser and coach were provided in the nick of time, and the Versailles road was so heavily guarded that a regiment of cavalry could scarce have dared intercept the carriage. According to one story, Choiseul even got a message past all the carefully reared barriers to Madame du Barry, prevailing on her to plead agonized illness and to keep to her bed on the evening set for the presentation. Whereupon, so runs the yarn, a character actor from the Comédie Française was paid to "make up" as Madame de Béarn and to perform her functions of sponsor. This may or may not be true. It forms the central theme of De Vere Stacpoole's novel, The Presentation. On the great night the court was assembled, tensely waiting for Marie to arrive. At the appointed time, no Madame du Barry appeared. The minutes grew into an hour. People began to whisper and fidget. The Choiseul party looked blissful. The clique could not hide its worry. Louis stood frowning between the suspense-stricken d'Aiguillon and Richelieu. At last he turned from them and stared moodily out of a window. Then, moving back into the room, he opened his lips to declare the levee at an end. As he started to speak, an usher announced, "Madame la Comtesse de Béarn, Madame la Comtesse du Barry," and Marie entered with her sponsor, or with someone who looked sufficiently like Madame de Béarn to deceive anyone. According to one version, Marie was late because at the last instant another Choiseul obstacle had to be cleared away. According to another, she was purposely late to enhance the dramatic interest of her arrival. Here is an account of the presentation. Madame du Barry, with her chaperone, advanced to where the king stood between their graces, the Dukes of Richelieu and Aiguillon. The formal words were spoken, and Madame du Barry sank to the ground before the king in a profound curtsy. He raised her right hand courteously, his lips twitching with laughter. She was decked in jewels, priced at $19,000, the gift of the king. She was garbed in one of the triumphant gowns that the women of the hour termed a fighting dress. So radiant an apparition was she, so dazzling at the first minute of surprise, that even her enemies could not libel her beauty. After she was presented to the king, she was duly presented to Mesdames, to the Dauphin, to the children of France. Marie had won. For the next 5 years she was the real Queen of France, and during that time she cost the French nation, in cold cash, something over $7,000,000. She was not at all on the style of the Pompadour, who had yearned to meddle in politics. Marie cared nothing for politics, except to help out her army of friends and dependents. She had no ambitions. She had not even craved on her own account to be the king's maîtresse en titre. All she wanted was to have a good time. And she had it. The pleasure was all hers. The French people did the paying, until years later they exacted bloody settlement of the score. Pompadour had worn out her life trying to amuse the unamusable, to find novelties that would entertain the king. Marie did nothing of the sort. Instead, she demanded that the king amuse her. Pompadour had sought to sway the destinies of nations. Marie was quite happy if she could spend the revenues of her own nation. She treated Louis in a way that caused the court to gasp with horror. She scolded him shrilly, petted him in public as if he had been her peasant spouse, and always addressed him as France. He enjoyed it. It was a novelty. Once, when she was giving an informal breakfast with a dozen or more nobles as guests, she ordered the king to make the coffee. Amused, he obeyed. She took one sip of the royal brewed beverage, then tossed the cup into the fireplace, exclaiming, "France, your coffee is as insipid as your talk." All political matters she turned over to d'Aiguillon, who was the clique's spokesman. To please him, and to get even for old scores, she caused the ruin of Choiseul. The mode of Choiseul's downfall is interesting as a sidelight on court intrigue. The clique taught Marie how to poison the king's ever suspicious mind against the prime minister, and she did so with great success. Thanks to her, Louis was held to believe that Choiseul, feeling his power over the monarch slipping, was planning a war scare with Spain, so that he could prove his seeming worth to the kingdom of France by dispelling the cloud. The clique, having access, through a spy, to all of Choiseul's correspondence, resorted to a fairly ingenious trick. At Marie's suggestion, Choiseul's secretary was summoned to the palace. He was in the clique's pay. Before the king he was questioned as to what he knew about Choiseul's affairs. The man, with an air of mystery, answered that he knew nothing of them, but that he would give his majesty one hint: let the king request Choiseul to write a letter to Spain, assuring that nation of France's peaceful intent. Should Choiseul do so without comment, it would show that he was not plotting a war scare as charged, but should he hesitate, well, what could that prove instead? The plotters already knew that Choiseul had that very day sent a letter to Spain, proposing the mutual signing of a declaration of peace between the nations. The king requested his minister to send a letter that was almost identical with the one he had already written and dispatched. Naturally, Choiseul hesitated, and the work was done. Yet, out of careless good nature, she would not have bothered to harm anybody, politically or otherwise, if she had had her own way. Marie insisted that the king settle a liberal pension on the fallen minister. This despite the fact that Choiseul and his sister, Madame de Gramont, had both worked with all their might and main to block her rise. She was good, too, as they all were, to her mother. She presented the horrible old woman with 2 or 3 estates and a generous income. She did the same for her titular husband, Guillaume, Comte de Berry. Her lightest fancy was enough to make or wreck any Frenchman. Everybody, high or low, was at her mercy. People of the bluest blood vied for chances to win her favor. The Chevalier de la Morlière dedicated his book on fatalism to her. The Duc de Tresmes, calling on her, sent in a note, "The monkey of Madame la Comtesse begs an audience." The Dauphin, afterward Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, the Dauphiness, were forced to abase themselves before this vulgarian woman whom they loathed. She reigned supreme. Extravagant as Pompadour had been, Marie was tenfold more so. She not only made the king gratify her every crazy whim, but she spent much time inventing crazy whims for him to gratify. If anything on sale was costly enough, she wanted it, whether it was pretty or hideous. All Marie demanded was that the article should be beyond the reach of any one else. In consequence, people who wanted to please her used to shower her with gifts more noteworthy for cost and for unusualness than for beauty. And one of these gifts chanced to be a jet black and quaintly deformed 10-year-old slave boy from Bengal. The slave's native name was unpronounceable, and the Prince of Conti, who had bought him from a sea captain and presented him to Marie, renamed him Louis Zamore. Marie was delighted with the boy as soon as she heard the price paid for him, and that he was the only one of his species in France. She dressed him in outlandish Eastern garb, and she used to tease him into screeching rages, as a mischievous child might tease a monkey. The slave child grew to detest his lovely owner. Remember Louis Zamore, please. He will come back into the story. Here is a correct but incomplete list of Marie's personal expenditures during the 5 years of her reign as brevet queen of France. To goldsmiths and jewelers, $424,000. To merchants of silks, laces, linens, millinery, $147,500. For furniture, pictures, vases, etc., $23,500. To gilders, sculptors, workers in marble, $75,000. On her estate at Lucienne, whose chateau was built in 3 months by the architect Ledoux, whom she thrust into the Academy for doing it, she spent $65,000. The heirs of one firm of creditors were, as late as 1836, still claiming the sum of $130,000 from her estate. She had state dresses, hooped dresses, dresses sur la considération, robes de toilette, dresses costing $200, $400, $600, and $1,000, dresses with a base of silver strewn with clusters of feathers, dresses striped with big bars of gold, mosaic dresses shot with gold and adorned with myrtle, and riding habits of white Indian silk that cost $1,200. She had dresses whose elaborate embroidery alone cost $2,100. Her dressing gowns had lace on them worth $500 and $800. She had cuffs of lace costing $125, point lace caps valued at $300, and point argentin costumes at $1,800. She ordered gold ornaments and trinkets of all sorts galore. Roetier, the goldsmith, received an order from her for a toilet set of solid gold, for which she had a sudden whim. The government advanced 12,000 ounces of gold for it. Boehmer, the Paris jeweler, knowing of her love for ultra-costly things, made up for her a huge diamond necklace of a heterogeneous mass of many-carat diamonds, arranged with regard to show and wholly without a thought of good taste. The necklace was so big and so expensive that Marie declared at once she must have it. Louis willingly consented to buy it for her, but he died before the purchase was made, and Boehmer was left with the ugly treasure loop on his hands. Long afterward he tried to sell it to Marie Antoinette, and from that transaction rose the mystery of the Queen's necklace, which did much to hasten the French Revolution. In the spring of 1774, as King Louis and Marie were driving toward Versailles, they saw a pretty girl in a wayside field, gathering grass for her cow. Louis greeted the girl with a fatherly smile. The girl looked back at him with perfect indifference. Piqued at such unwonted contempt for his royal self, the king got out of his carriage, waddled across to where the girl stood, and kissed her. The reason she had seemed indifferent was because she was dazed. The reason she was dazed was that she was in the early stages of smallpox. Louise caught the infection and died a few days later. The first act of Louis XVI, the king's grandson and successor, was to order Marie to a convent. Later he softened the decree by allowing her to live at Lucienne, or anywhere else outside a 10-mile radius from Paris. Then it was that the fallen favorite met Cosse once more, and their old-time love story recommenced, this time on a less platonic footing. She kept her title of Comtesse, and had enough money, as she paid few of her debts, to live in luxury, still beautiful, still loved, still moderately young. The Revolution burst forth. Marie enrolled herself as a staunch loyalist. Hearing that the king and queen were pressed for funds, she wrote to Marie Antoinette: "Lucienne is yours, madame. All that I possess comes to me from the royal family. I am too grateful ever to forget it. The late king, with a sort of presentiment, forced me to accept 1,000 precious objects. I have had the honor of making you an inventory of these treasures. I offer them to you with eagerness. You have so many expenses to meet, and benefits without number to bestow. Permit me, I entreat you, to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's." When the king and queen were beheaded, she secretly wore black for them. Also, she made a trip to England, where she tried to sell some of her jewels to help the royalist cause. All these things were duly repeated to the revolutionary government by Louis Zamore, her Bengalese servant. One evening she was expecting a visit from Cosse, but midnight came, and he had not appeared. "Go down the road," she ordered Zamore, who had just returned from an errand to Paris, "and see if you can catch sight of him." "I can show him to you, or part of him, without troubling to do that," retorted Zamore with sudden insolence. Whipping one hand from behind his back, he tossed on the floor at Marie's feet the head of her lover. Cosse had been guillotined that day. Zamore, in return for certain information to the government, had received the head as a gift. The information he had given led to Marie's arrest on the following charges: having wasted the treasures of the state, conspiring with the enemies of the Republic, and having in London worn mourning for the late king. Marie was sentenced to death on December 7, 1793, and was beheaded the same day. Almost alone of all the French women thus put to death, she turned coward at the last. The strain of peasant blood came to the fore, and where aristocrats rode smiling to the scaffold, Marie du Barry behaved like a panic-stricken child. She fell on her knees and begged for her life. She told where every article of value she possessed was buried in her garden. If she thought thus to buy back her life, she did not understand the souls of such men as her captors. They heard her to the end, jotting down the directions for finding her treasure. Then, when she was put into the tumbrel and was started on her way to the scaffold, the journey led past the old millinery shop where she had once worked. As she caught sight of its sign, she screamed out twice. The crowd had long ago grown accustomed to the sight of death. Now they seemed to awaken to the fact that they were about to kill a woman, a wondrous beautiful woman at that. A sigh of pity ran through the throng. The driver in charge of the tumbrel, fearing a riot and a rescue, whipped up the horses and drove on with his load. There were others besides Madame du Barry in the death wagon. The cart reached the scaffold at 4:30 in the afternoon. Marie was the first to mount the steps to the guillotine. Says de Goncourt, her biographer, "They heard her on the steps of the scaffold, lost and desperate, mad with anguish and terror, struggling, imploring, begging for mercy, crying, 'Help, help,' like a woman being assassinated by robbers. Then fell the axe edge, and Marie's $7 million debt to the people of France was paid." End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 10. The Most Gorgeous Lady Blessington. She was the ugly duckling of a family of 7 beautiful children, the children of queer old Shiver-the-Frills Power of Tipperary. Her name was Marguerite. Her father picked out a pretty name for the homely girl, and then considered his duty done. Marguerite was a great trial to everybody, to her good-looking brothers and lovely sisters, to Shiver-the-Frills, who was bitterly chagrined that his record for beauteous offspring should have been marred by so hideous an exception, to the family governess, who wouldn't even take the trouble to teach her to read, to the neighbors, whose joy in beauty she offended. Altogether, Marguerite was taught to consider herself a mistake. It is a lesson that children learn with pitiful readiness. Perhaps the mystic, unpardonable sin consists in teaching them such a damnable doctrine. Her father's baptismal name was not really Shiver-the-Frills, though nobody ever spoke of him by any other term. He had been christened Edmund, and he was a squireen of the Tipperary village of Knockbrit. He was a local magistrate, and he fulfilled his magisterial office almost as well as a mad dog might have done. He had an insane temper. He did not confine this to his home, where he beat his children and servants most unmercifully, but aired it on the bench as well. Notably, when, in a rage, he lawlessly commandeered a troop of dragoons and galloped over Tipperary and Waterford counties with them, hunting down and killing peasants who had stirred his anger to maniac heat by some petty uprising. He was a dandy, fop, macaroni, toff, whatever you choose, too, in a tarnished and down-at-heel way. And from his habit of eternally shaking out his dirty shirt-ruffles and lace wristbands in order to keep them from hanging limply, he was called Shiver-the-Frills. Marguerite's home life was one unbroken hell. Starvation, shabby genteel rags, beatings, and full-flavored curses were her daily portion. A kind-hearted neighbor, Miss Ann Dwyer, took pity on the poor, abused little ugly duckling and taught her to read and write. But for this she would have grown up too ignorant to pass the very simplest literacy test. And an odd use the child proceeded to make of her smattering of education. Before she could spell correctly, she began to write stories. These she would read aloud by the peat smolder on winter evenings to her awed brothers and sisters, who looked on such an accomplishment as little short of supernatural. Wonderful stories she wrote, all about princesses who had all the clothes they could wear, and who could afford 3 square meals with real butter every single day of their lives, and about princes who never swore at or beat children or flew into crazy rages or even fluttered dirty ruffles. The girl's gift at story-writing gave her a higher place in the family esteem than she had ever enjoyed before. So did another miracle which came to pass when Marguerite was about 12. She grew pretty. The ugly duckling, in less than a single year, developed from repulsive homeliness into a striking beauty. In fact, by the time she was 14, she was far and away the loveliest of all the exquisite Power sisters. Then began her career of Superwoman. For with dawning beauty came an access of the elusive charm that sets Marguerite's type apart from the rest of womankind. And men were swift to recognize her claim to their worship. The swains whom Shiver-the-Frills allowed to visit his tumble-down mansion paid court to her instead of to her sisters. The fame of her reached the nearby garrison town of Clonmel, and brought a host of young redcoat officers swarming to the Knockbrit house. Of these officers, too, soon put themselves far in the van of all other contestants. They were Captain Murray and Captain Maurice St. Farmer. Murray was a jolly, happy-go-lucky, penniless chap, lovable and ardent. The kindest thing one can say about Captain Farmer is that he was more than half insane. Marguerite met Captain Murray's courtship more than halfway, but Shiver the Frills told the sighing but impecunious swain to keep off, and ordered Marguerite to marry Farmer, who had a snug fortune. Marguerite very naturally objected. Shiver the Frills flew into a ready-made rage, and frightened the poor youngster almost to death by his threats of what should befall her if she did not change her mind. So, cowed into submission, she meekly agreed to marry Farmer, and marry him she did, in 1805, when she was but 15. It was an early marrying age even in that era of early marriages. Many years had passed since Sheridan's metrical toast to the maiden of bashful 15, and as now a girl of 15 was deemed too young for wedlock. But all this did not deter old Shiver the Frills from a laudable firmness in getting rid of the daughter he hated. So he married her off, to a man who ought to have been in an insane asylum, in an asylum for the criminally insane at that. If Marguerite's life at Knockbrit had been unhappy, her new life was positive torture. Farmer's temper was worse than Shiver the Frills, and he added habitual drunkenness to his other allurements. There is no profit in going into full details of Marguerite's horrible sojourn with him. One of his milder amusements was to pinch her until the blood spurted from her white flesh. He flogged her as he never dared flog his dogs, and he used to lock her for days in an unheated room in winter with nothing to eat or drink. Marguerite stood it as long as she could. Then she ran away. You can imagine how insufferable she had found Farmer when I say she went back by choice to her father's house. Shiver the Frills greeted the unhappy girl with one of his dear old rages. His rage was not levelled at the cur who had so vilely misused her, but against the young wife who had committed the crime of deserting her husband. Not being of the breed that uses bare fingers to test the efficiency of buzz-saws, I neither express nor so much as dare to cherish in secret any opinion whatsoever on the theme of women's rights, but it is a wholly safe and non-controversial thing to say that the fate of woman at large, and especially of husband-deserters, today, is paradise by comparison with what it was a century ago. For leaving a husband who had not refused to harbor her, Marguerite became, in a measure, an outcast. She could not divorce Farmer. She could not make him support her unless she would return to him. She was eyed askance by the elect. Her own family felt that she was smirched. Shiver the Frills cursed her roundly, and is said to have assumed the heavy father role by ordering her to leave his ramshackle old house. Without money, without protector, without reputation, she was cast adrift. There was no question of alimony, of legal redress, of freedom. The laws were all on Farmer's side. So was public opinion. Strange to say, no public benefactor even took the trouble to horsewhip the husband. He was not even ostracized from his own circle for his treatment to his girl wife. Remember, this was in the earliest years of the 19th century, and in a country where many people still regarded wife-beating as a healthful indoor sport. Less than 3 decades had elapsed since a man immortalized by Thackeray had made the proud boast that, during the first year of his married life, he had never, when sober, struck his wife in anger. Nor was it so very long after the Lord Chief Justice of England handed down an official decision that a man might legally punish his wife with a rod no thicker than his lordship's thumb. Whereat One woman inquired anxiously whether his lordship chanced to suffer from gouty swelling of the hands. Oh, it was a merry time and a merry land for women, this merry England of the good old days. Marguerite vanished from home, from friends, from family, and a blank space follows. In the lives of scores of superwomen, of Lola Montez, Marie de Chevreuse, Lady Hamilton, Ada Menken, Peg Woffington, Adrienne Lecouvreur, even of Cleopatra, there was somewhere a hiatus, a dark spot that they would never afterward consent to illumine. And such a line of asterisks sheared its way across Marguerite's page at this point. She is next heard of as leading a charmingly un-nun-like existence at Cahair, and 2 years later at Dublin. At the Irish metropolis she enamored the great Sir Thomas Lawrence, whose portrait of her is one of his most famous paintings, and one that is familiar to nearly everybody. The picture was painted in 1809, when Marguerite was just 20 and in the early prime of her beauty. She had ever a knack of enslaving army men, and her next wooer, in fact, Lawrence's lucky rival, was an Irish captain, one Jenkins. She and Jenkins fell very seriously in love with each other. There was nothing at all platonic in their relations. Jenkins was eager to marry Marguerite, and when he found he could not do so because of the trifling obstacle that her husband was alive, he sought a chance to put Captain Maurice St. Leger farmer out of the road. But he was a square sort of chap in his way, this lovelorn Jenkins. He balked at the idea of murder, and a duel would have put him in peril of losing Marguerite by dying. So he let Farmer severely alone, and contented himself by waiting impatiently until the drunken husband emeritus should see fit to die. And until that happy hour should come, he declared that Marguerite was at least his wife in the eyes of heaven. Startlingly novel mode of gluing together the fragments of a fractured commandment. But the strange part of the affair is that Captain Jenkins' eminently respectable family consented to take the same view of the case, and publicly welcomed Marguerite as the captain's legal wife. And so, for a time, life went on. Marguerite was as nearly respectable as the laws of her time gave her the right to be. Jenkins was all devotion. She was moderately well received in local society, and she kept on winning the hearts of all the men who ventured within her sway. Then into her life swirled Charles John Gardiner, Earl of Blessington, one of the most eccentric and thoroughly delightful figures of his day. Blessington was an Irish peer, a widower, a man of fashion. He had a once enormous rent-roll that had been sadly honeycombed by his mad extravagances, but that still totaled $150,000 a year. What chance had the worthy but humble Captain Jenkins against this golden-tinged whirlwind wooer? And the answer to that conundrum is the same that serves for the question concerning the hackneyed snowball in the Inferno. Blessington swept Marguerite off her feet, bore her away from the protesting captain, and installed her in a mansion of her own. Then, too late, came the happy event for which Jenkins and Marguerite had so optimistically been looking. In October 1817, Captain Maurice St. Leger farmer joined some boon companions in an all-night orgy in the upper room of a pot-house. Farmer waxed so much drunker than usual that he mistook the long window of the room for the door. Bidding his friends good-bye, he strolled out of the window into space. Being a heavier-than-air body, in spite of the spirits that buoyed him up, he drifted downward into the courtyard below, breaking his miserable neck. Marguerite was free. Jenkins hastened to her and besought her to marry him, offering her an honorable name and a place in the world, and pointing out to her how much better off she would be in the long run as Mrs. Captain Jenkins than as the brevet bride of a dissolute earl. But Blessington had by this time become the helpless thrall of Marguerite's charm. As soon as he heard of Farmer's death, he whisked her off to church and married her. And by way of doing all things handsomely, he soothed the disconsolate Jenkins' feelings with a $50,000 check, thereby securing firm title to the goodwill and fixtures of the previous tenant of his wife's heart. The Earl took his new wife to his ancestral home at Mountjoy Forest, and there the couple kept open house, spending money like drunken sailors, and having a wonderful time. It was the first chance Marguerite had ever had for spending any large amount of money. She so well improved her opportunities along this line, and got such splendid results therefrom, that she was nicknamed by a flowery Irish admirer the most gorgeous Lady Blessington, and the name stuck to her delight, all through life. Blessington had always been extravagant. Now, goaded on by Marguerite, he proceeded to make the prodigal son look like Gaspard the miser. One of his lesser expenditures was the building of a theatre on his own estate, that he and Marguerite might satisfy to the full their love for amateur theatricals. At this theatre they and their friends were the only performers, and their friends were the only spectators. The performances must have been gems of histrionic and literary excellence, and a rare delight to every one concerned. It would have been worth walking barefoot for miles to witness one of them, for the actors were bound by a list of hard and fast rules, devised and written out by Lord Blessington himself. You may judge the rest of these rules by the first, which read, "Every gentleman shall be at liberty to avail himself of the words of the author, in case his own invention fails him." One's heart warms to the genius who could frame that glorious rule for stage dialogue. But Marguerite was of no mind to be mured up in an Irish country house, with perhaps an occasional trip to Dublin. She had begun to taste life, and she found the draught too sweet to be swallowed in sips. She made Blessington take a house in St. James's Square in London. There, for the next 3 years, she was the reigning beauty of the capital. Her salons were the most brilliant spots in the London season. Her loveliness made her and her home a centre of admiration. She had more than good looks, more even than charm. She had brains, and she had true Irish wit, a wit that flashed and never stung. She had, too, the knack of bringing out the best and brightest elements in everyone around her. So while men adored her, women could not bring themselves to hate her. She was in her element there in London, but Blessington was not in his. He enjoyed it all, but he was no longer young, and he had led a lightning rapid life. So though he was ever a willing performer, the merciless pace began to tell on him. Marguerite was quick to notice this, and she suggested that a nice, long, lazy tour of the Continent might brace him up. Marguerite's lightest suggestions were her husband's laws, so to the Continent they went, and London mourned them. They set off in August, 1822. "No Irish nobleman," says one biographer, "and certainly no Irish king, ever set out on his travels with such a retinue of servants, with so many vehicles and appliances of all kinds to ease, to comfort, and the luxurious enjoyment of travel." They planned to go by easy stages, stopping wherever they chose and for as long as the fancy held them. They travelled in a way a modern pork king might envy. One day in Paris, at the races, Lady Blessington exclaimed, "There is the handsomest man I have ever seen." One of the throng of adorers hanging about the Blessington box confessed to knowing the stranger, and he was accordingly sent off post haste to bring the handsomest man to the box. The personage who was so lucky as to draw forth this cry of admiration from Marguerite was at that time but 18 years old. Yet already he was one of the most noted, or notorious, men about town in all Europe. He was Alfred Guillaume Gabriel, Count d'Orsay, a typical Ouida hero. He was 6 feet in height, with broad shoulders, small hands and feet, hazel eyes, and chestnut hair. He was an all-around athlete, could ride, fence, box, skate, shoot, and so on, through the whole list of sports. He was a brilliant conversationalist. He could draw. He could paint. He was a sculptor. And at none of these things was he an amateur, but as good as most front-rank professionals. He was later to win fame as the premier man of fashion of the period. A once celebrated book, The Complete Dandy, had d'Orsay for its hero. Everybody who came in touch with the youthful paragon fell victim to his magnetism, and even Lord Blessington, who should have been wise enough to see what was coming, was no exception. Young d'Orsay, at Marguerite's instigation, was invited to go along with the Blessingtons on the rest of their travels. He accepted. This meant his resignation from his regiment, which was at that moment under orders to leave France to invade Spain. He threw over his military career without a qualm. He had fallen in love at sight with the most gorgeous Lady Blessington, who was 14 years his senior, and at sight she had fallen in love with him. It was the love of her life. The party moved on to Genoa. Here they met Lord Byron, who had found England a chilly abiding place after the disgraceful affair that had parted him from his wife. Byron was charmed by Lady Blessington's beauty and cleverness, and spent a great deal of time with the Blessington party of tourists. D'Orsay he liked immensely, once referring to him as a Greek god returned to earth. Marguerite he frankly adored. And, so far as one knows, that was all the good it did him. With a wonder youth of the d'Orsay type ever at her side, Lady Blessington was not likely to lose her sophisticated heart to a middle-aged, lame man, whose power over women was at this time largely confined to girls in their teens. But Byron was the greatest living poet, as well as the greatest living charlatan, and Marguerite consented to be amused in desultory fashion by his stereotyped form of heart-siege, even though his powers of attack were no longer sufficient to storm the citadel. Still, the time passed pleasantly enough at Genoa, and Byron solved his bruised vanity by wheedling Lord Blessington into buying his yacht, a boat that the poet had long and vainly tried to get rid of. Faring better with my lord than with my lady, he sold the boat at a fancy figure. There was a farewell banquet, at which he drank much. Then the Blessingtons and d'Orsay departed from Genoa on the White Elephant yacht, and Byron stood on the quay and wept aloud as they sailed off. They went to Rome, but the Eternal City somehow did not appeal to Lady Blessington. So they gave it what would now be vulgarly termed the once-over, and passed on to Naples. Here Marguerite was delighted with everything. The trio took a Naples house and lived there for 2½ years. The mansion Lord Blessington rented was the Palazzo Belvedere, which cost him an enormous sum. But, like an automobile, the initial price was the smallest item of its expense. Marguerite, perhaps to atone to herself for the squalor of her rickety girlhood home, declared the place would not be fit to live in until it had been refitted according to her ideas. Her ideas cost a fortune to carry out. But when at last the work was done, she wrote that the palazzo was one of the most delicious retreats in the world. She also hit on a thoroughly unique, if costly, scheme for sightseeing. For example, when she visited Herculaneum, it was with the archaeologist Sir William Gell as guide. When she went to museums and art galleries, she took along a showman such celebrities as Unwin, the painter, Westmacott, the sculptor, or the antiquary, Milligan. And when she visited the observatory, it was under the guidance of Sir John Herschel and the Italian astronomer Piazzi. More than one of these notables sighed hopelessly for her love. From Naples the party went to Florence. Here Walter Savage Landor met Marguerite, and he was little behind Byron in his appreciation of her charms. By this time, nay, long before this time, people had begun to talk, and to talk quite distinctly. Marguerite did not care to be the butt of international gossip, so she enlisted her husband's aid in an effort to silence the scandalous tongues. Blessington's mode of doing this was highly characteristic of the most eccentric man living. He promptly offered to make d'Orsay his heir if the latter would marry Lord Blessington's 15-year-old daughter, the Earl's only living child by his first wife. D'Orsay did not object. It mattered little to him whom he married. The girl was sent for to come to Florence, and there she and D'Orsay were made man and wife. The trio thus enlarged to a quartet, all hands next set off for Paris. Lady Blessington learned that the house of Maréchal Ney was vacant, and she made her husband take it at a staggering rental. And again she was not satisfied until the place had been done over from top to bottom. The job was finished in 3 days, the army of workmen receiving triple pay for quadruple speed. Lady Blessington's own room was designed by her husband. He would not allow her to see it until everything was in readiness for her. This is her own description of it. The bed, which is silvered instead of gilt, rests on the backs of 2 large silver swans, so exquisitely sculptured that every feather is in alto relievo, and looks nearly as fleecy as those of a living bird. The recess in which it is placed is lined with white fluted silk, bordered with blue embossed lace, and from the columns that support the frieze of the recess, pale blue silk curtains, lined with white, are hung, which, when drawn, conceal the recess altogether. A silvered sofa has been made to fit the side of the room opposite the fireplace. Pale blue carpets, silver lamps, ornaments silvered to correspond. The salle de bain is draped with white muslin trimmed with lace. The bath is of white marble, inserted in the floor, with which its surface is level. On the ceiling, a painting of Flora scattering flowers with one hand, while from the other is suspended an alabaster lamp in the form of a lotus. It was in this house that Lord Blessington died of apoplexy in 1829, perhaps after a glimpse of the bills for renovating the place. Marguerite, on his death, was left with a jointure in his estate, which estate by this time had dwindled to $50,000 per annum. Her sole share of it was $7,500 a year, and the Blessington townhouse in London. All along, D'Orsay and his wife had been living with the Blessingtons. When Lady Blessington came back to England, they accompanied her, and the three took up their odd form of life together at Gore House in Kensington. Albert Hall now stands on its site, for Marguerite could not afford to keep up the Blessington mansion. She tried to eke out her income by writing, for she still had the pen gift that had so awed her brothers and sisters. One of her first pieces of work was a book based on her talks with Byron back in the Genoa days. The New Monthly Magazine first printed serially this capitalization of a dead romance. The volume later came out as Conversations with Byron. And of all Marguerite's 18 books, this is perhaps the only one now remembered. She was engaged at $2,500 a year to supply a newspaper with society items. Then, too, she edited Gems of Beauty, a publication containing portraits of fair women, with a descriptive verse written by her under each picture, straight hack work. Altogether, she made about $5,000 a year by her pen, a goodly income for a woman writer in her day, or in any day for that matter. Among her novels were Meredith, Grace Cassidy, The Governess, and The Victims of Society. You have never read any of them, I think. If you tried to, as did I, they would bore you as they bored me. They have no literary quality, and their only value is in their truthful depiction of the social life of her times. She did magazine work, too, and wrote for such chaste publications as Friendship's Offering, The Amulet, Keepsakes, and others of like mushiness of name and matter. Once more, her salons were the talk of all England, and once more the best men crowded to them. But no longer did the best women frequent the Blessington receptions. The scandal that had been hushed by the sacrifice of the Earl's daughter to a man who loved her stepmother had blazed up fresh when the D'Orsays went to live at Gore House with Marguerite, and women fought shy of the lovely widow. It is one of the mysteries of the ages that so canny an old libertine as Lord Blessington should have been hoodwinked by D'Orsay and Marguerite. There is no clue to it, except perhaps he was not fooled. Perhaps he was too old, too sick, too indifferent to care. And when D'Orsay's unhappy young wife in 1838 refused to be a party any longer to the disgusting farce and divorced her husband, the gossip whispers swelled to a screech. The wife departed, D'Orsay stayed on. There is every reason to think Marguerite was true to her young Greek god, but if so, it was not for lack of temptation or opportunity to be otherwise. In her late 40s and early 50s, she was still the most gorgeous Lady Blessington, still as lovely, as magnetic, as adorable as in her teens. Among the men who delighted to honor her salons with their frequent presence, and more than one of them made desperate love to their hostess, were Bulwer, Dickens, Thackeray, Sir Robert Peel, Captain Marryat, Brougham, Landseer, Tom Moore, Disraeli, and many another genius. Disraeli, one day to rule British politics as Lord Beaconsfield, was at that time merely a brilliant politician and an almost equally brilliant novelist. There is a story, I don't vouch for it, that, piqued at Marguerite's coldness toward himself, Disraeli revenged himself by portraying D'Orsay right mercilessly as Count Mirabeau in his Henrietta Temple. Landor was drawn by her lure into returning to England. The aged Duke of Wellington, too, was a guest at her more informal at-homes. Marguerite used such influence as she possessed over the Duke to persuade him to let D'Orsay paint his portrait. So well did the picture turn out that the Duke cried in delight, "At last I've been painted as a gentleman." To the Blessington salons came an American, a man whose clothes were the hopeless envy of Broadway, and whose forehead curl was imitated by every Yankee dandy who could afford to buy enough pomatum to stick a similar curl to his own brow. He was N.P. Willis. You don't even start at the name. Yet that name used to thrill your grandmother. Willis was a writer, and gained more temporary fame for less good work than any other author our country has produced. During a tour of England, he was fortunate enough to receive an invitation to call on Lady Blessington. And thereafter he called almost every day. He fairly raved over her. "She is one of the most lovely and fascinating women I have ever known," he wrote. Then he wrote more. He wrote a story of something that happened at one of her soirees. He sent it to an American paper, never dreaming it would ever be seen in England. But the story was reprinted in an English magazine, and D'Orsay showed Willis the door. Another visitor to Gore House was a pallid, puffy princeling, out of a job and out of a home. He was Louis Napoleon, reputed nephew of Napoleon the Great, and he was one day to reign as Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. In the meantime, exiled from France, he knocked around the world, morbidly wondering where his next suit of ready-made clothes was to come from. He even visited the United States for a while, teaching school at Bordentown, New Jersey, and sponging for loans and dinners from the Jumels and other people kindly disposed to the Bonaparte cause. Just now he was in England, living when he could on borrowed money, and sometimes earning a few shillings by serving as special policeman outside of big houses where dances or receptions were in progress. Out of the few English homes open to the prince was Marguerite Blessington's. Marguerite and D'Orsay took him in, fed him, lent him money, and did 1,000 kindnesses to the poor outlawed fellow. You shall learn in a few minutes how he repaid their generosity. While Marguerite had a talent for writing, she had a positive genius for spending money. And where talent and genius clash, there can be only one final result. Her talent, as I have said, brought her about $5,000 a year. Her income from her husband's estate was a yearly $7,500 more. But how could people like Marguerite and D'Orsay keep abreast of the social current on a beggarly $12,500 a year? The foregoing is a question, not a flight of rhetoric. It has an answer, and the answer is they went into debt. They threw away money, as apt pupils of the lamented Earl of Blessington might readily have been expected to. When they had no more money to pay with, they got credit. At first this was easy enough. Tradesmen, high and low, deemed it an honor to be creditors of the all-popular Dowager Countess of Blessington and of the illustrious Count d'Orsay. And even after the tradesmen's first zest died down, the couple were clever enough to arrange matters in such a way as to keep right on securing goods for which they knew they never could hope to pay. Stripped of his glamour, his pretty tricks, and his social position, D'Orsay shows up as an unadulterated deadbeat, a sublimated panhandler, while Marguerite's early experience in helping shiver the frills, ward off bailiffs, and such-like gold-seekers now stood in her fine stead. They were a grand pair. Their teamwork was perfect. Between them, they succeeded in rolling up debts amounting to more than $535,000 to tradesfolk alone. D'Orsay, in addition to this, managed to borrow about $65,000 from over-trustful personal friends. Thackeray is said to have drawn from them the inspiration of his Vanity Fair essay on How to Live on Nothing a Year. D'Orsay, before consenting to let his wife divorce him, had stipulated that the Earl's daughter pay him a huge lump sum out of the Blessington estate. He was also lucky at so-called games of chance, and his painting brought in a good revenue. But all this money was swallowed up in the bottomless gulf of extravagance. Little by little, the tradesmen began to realize that they were never going to be paid, and they banded together to force matters to a crisis. In that era, debt was still punishable by imprisonment, and prison gates were almost ready to unbar in hospitable welcome to Marguerite and D'Orsay. Like Dick Swiveller, who shut for himself, one by one, every avenue of egress from his home by means of unpaid-for purchases in neighboring streets, D'Orsay discovered that it was no longer safe to leave the house. Officers with warrants lurked at the area railings of Gore House. Tipstaves loitered on the front steps. All sorts of shabby people seemed eager to come into personal contact with Alfred Guillaume Gabriel, Count d'Orsay. On Sunday alone, when the civil arm of the law rests, did the much sought-after couple dare emerge from the once joyous house which had grown to be their beleaguered castle. No longer could they entertain as of yore, lest a rascally warrant-server slip into the drawing-room in the guise of a guest. Finally, the net tightened to such an extent that d'Orsay had great ado to slip through its one gap, but slip through he did, and escaped by night to France. Marguerite's wit arranged for his escape, and the man who lately had disdained to take a week-end journey without a half-dozen servants and a half-score trunks was forced to run away in the clothes he wore and with single portmanteau. Marguerite joined him at Boulogne, little better equipped than he. Oh, but there were heartbreaking sights in those days, in Boulogne, in Calais, and in Havre. Englishmen who had fled their own country for debt used to haunt the French seaboard, as being nearer their own dear land than was Paris. They used to pace the esplanades, or cower like sick dogs on the quays, straining their eyes across the tumbled grey water to glimpse the far-off white cliffs of their homeland. They would flock to the pier when the Channel packets came in, longing for the sight of a home face, dreading to be seen by someone who had known them in sunnier days. Sneered at by the thrifty French, denied a penny's worth of credit at the shops, they dragged out desolate lives, 50 times more bitter than death. It was no part of Marguerite's scheme to enroll d'Orsay and herself among these hangdog exiles. She had ever built air castles, and she was still building them. She had wonderful plans for a career in France. She and d'Orsay had done much for Louis Napoleon in his days of poverty. And now Louis Napoleon was president of France, and already there were rumors that he would soon make himself emperor. He was the man of the hour, and in his heyday of prosperity he assuredly could do no less than find a high government office for d'Orsay, and pour a flood of golden coin into the lap of the most gorgeous Lady Blessington. Let me save you from suspense by telling you that Louis Napoleon did nothing of the sort. Indeed, he seemed much embarrassed and not at all overjoyed by the arrival of his old benefactors in Paris. He made them many glittering promises, but the Bank of Fools itself would have had too much sense to discount such promises as Louis Napoleon was wont to make. Soon after their arrival in Paris, Marguerite learned that creditors had swooped down upon Gore House, seizing it and all the countless art treasures that filled it. House and contents went under the hammer and brought a bare $60,000, not enough to pay one of the d'Orsay-Blessington debts. Marguerite was at the end of her career. She was 60 years old. Her beauty was going. Her money was gone. She had ruled hearts. She had squandered fortunes. She had gone through the dark spot, 99% of whose victims sink thence to the street, while the 100th has the amazing luck to emerge as a superwoman. She had listened to the love vows of men whose names are immortal, and now she was old and fat and banished. Hope was dead. A younger and stronger woman might readily have succumbed under such a crisis. Certainly, Marguerite Blessington was in no condition to face it. Soon after she arrived in Paris, she sickened and died. D'Orsay had loved her with fairly good constancy, and he designed in her honor a double grave mausoleum of quaint design, and under that mausoleum, at Chambouret, she was buried. 3 years later, D'Orsay was laid there at her side. Superwoman and Superman, they had loved as had Cleopatra and Antony. Only, in the latter's day, it was Rome's vengeance and not a creditor warrant that cut short such golden romances. End of chapter 10. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 11 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 11. Madame Recamier, the Frozen-Hearted Angel. Paris, the hopelessly mixed sans-culotte philosopher New Paris Society of 1793, took a holiday from red slaughter and reflection on the rights of man, and went to an odd wedding. The wedding of a 15-year-old girl to a man of nearly 50. Probably, even in that less bromidic day, there were not lacking a few hundred guests to commit the ancient wheeze anent May and December. The girl was a beauty of the type that it tightens one's throat to look at, and the man was an egregiously rich banker. So Paris deigned to be interested even into momentary forgetfulness of the day's List of the Condemned and of Robespierre's newest patriotic murder dreams. The girl bride was Jean-François Julie Adelaide Bernard, daughter of no less a dignitary than the Paris's receiver of taxes, a mild-mannered and handsome man, weak and stupid, with a handsome and steel-eyed wife who was neither dull, weak, nor good. The groom was Jacques Recamier, by profession a powerful banker, by choice a middle-class Lothario. His father had sold hats at Lyons. Recamier had been an intimate friend of the Bernards, forever at their house since a year or so before Jean had been born. As the wedding party stood on the steps of the Hôtel de Ville after the civil ceremony, so runs the story, a passing man halted and gazed long and closely at Jean in dumb admiration, studying every line of her face and form. The gazer was a painter, Greuze by name, and from Jean Recamier, as he saw her that day, he drew the inspiration for the wonderful Jeune Fille picture that made him immortal. The wedding party filed into a line of waiting carriages, but scarce had the joyous cavalcade set out on its short journey when it was halted by the passage of a truly horrible procession that just then emerged from a cross street. A procession made up of scarecrow men and women, hideous of visage, clad in rags, blood from the guillotine, around which they had lately gathered, gloating, spattered on their clothes and unwashed faces. In the midst of the howling and huzzahing throng was a chair, carried by supports on the shoulders of 8 half-naked sans-culottes, and in this lofty chair crouched the most hideous figure in all that vile gathering, a dwarfish, weirdly dressed man, his face disgustingly marred by disease, his eyes glaring with the light of madness. Around him gamboled the mob, screaming blessings and adulations, strewing his bearer's way with masses of wilted flowers filched from the Halles. Thus did Dr. Jean-Paul Marat make his triumphal return home that April day from the convention, escorted by his worshippers and fellow beasts. Thus did his obscene retinue block the wedding procession of dainty little Jean Recamier. Jean-Paul Marat, for whose shrunken chest at that very moment poor politics-crazed Charlotte Corday was sharpening the 28-cent case-knife she had just bought. An odd omen for the outset of married life, and vitally so to the little new-wed Recamier girl, who had been brought up amid superstitions. Shall we glance at a short word picture of Jean, limned by a contemporary? She has orange-tinted eyes, but they are without fire, pretty and transparent teeth, but incapable of snapping, an ungainly waist, coarse hands and feet, and complexion that is a bowl of milk wherein float rose-leaves. Let me add to the sketch the established fact that during the 71 years of her life no man so such as boasted that he had received a caress or a love-word from her. But don't lose interest in her pleas on that account. Dozens of men would blithely have tossed away their souls for the privilege of making that boast truthfully. Failing, they nicknamed her the Angel of the Frozen Heart. Against her alone, perhaps, of all superwomen, no word of scandal was ever breathed. Chiefly, it has been claimed, for physical reasons. Let me touch, as briefly as I can, on a story at which Madame Lenormand, her own cousin, broadly hints, and which Terhune openly declares true. Says the former, among other and closer comments on the theme, Madame Recamier received from her husband but his name. His affection was paternal. He treated as a daughter the woman who carried his name. Says Terhune, she was Recamier's daughter. And so, by all testimony, she was. Years before, Recamier had had a love affair with Madame Bernard, an affair that the stupid Bernard had condoned, if he had known of its existence. Nor, said gossip of the day, was it Madame Bernard's sole indiscretion. Jean had been born. From her earliest babyhood, Recamier had all but worshipped her. Not a day had passed but he had come to see her. He had loaded her with toys, jewelry, candy. He had been her fairy godfather. She had grown up calling him Daddy Recamier. Then came the Reign of Terror. Old Bernard's life was in considerable danger. In fact, he used to go to the guillotine daily to watch executions, that he might become used to his fate. Madame Bernard was no fit guardian for a young and incredibly lovely girl in the rotten Paris of that day. So, Recamier, rich and powerful, chose the surest means to safeguard the daughter who was all the world to him. He went through a meaningless civil ceremony with her, and installed her, with a retinue of servants, in one half of his big house. Then and thereafter, she was Madame Recamier in name alone. Recamier tenderly watching over her, giving her every luxury money could buy, and observing with a total absence of jealousy her innumerable conquests. These conquests had begun, by the way, even before Jean's early marriage. When she was but 13, a young man named Humblot had fallen madly in love with her. To keep Jean from reciprocating his flame, she had been packed off to a convent school. Shortly after the marriage, the Reign of Terror simmered down to the more peaceful, if more corrupt, Directory. Society reassembled on its peak, after the years of guillotine-aided class leveling, and in this heterogeneous society, Jean blazed forth as a star. Says Sainte-Beuve, the world Madame Recamier traversed at this period was very mixed and very ardent. To its adoration, the girl bride lent an amused but wholly impersonal ear. Vaguely she used to wonder why men wept at her feet and poured forth their souls in noisy love for her. Their antics found no response in her own untouched heart. Yet she found them interesting, and therefore, in a demure way, she encouraged them. Not that such encouragement was really needed. Presently, out of the chaos of social and political conditions, arose Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, I know he appears unduly often in this series, but he appeared unduly often in the lives of a score of superwomen, Madame Jumel, Elizabeth Patterson, Mademoiselle Georges, Countess Potocka, and the rest, and his name is more often seen in all history written since 1790 than that of any other man. So be patient if he crops up oftener than the balance of power seems to call for. Napoleon, first as dictator and then as emperor, ruled France. As a young man, he had been too poor and too busy to glance at any woman. Now, in his days of power and, for him, leisure, he amply made up for such early defects, and presently his alternately pale and jet-black eyes fell upon Jeanne Recamier. Forthwith he began to make right ardent love to her. Napoleon, once and only once in all his strange career, had actually lost his level head through love, and had been carried by it out of his cool, calculating self. That was when, as a lean, half-starved, hectic young officer of artillery, he had met Josephine Beauharnais. She was a Creole widow, much older than he. Much slush has been written of her and her wrongs. History, from every source, tells another story. Napoleon used to meet Josephine at the house of the director Barras, where she held a somewhat equivocal position. Barras had begun to tire of her. Her teeth were bad. She was beginning to wrinkle and grow sallow. She was silly. She had absolutely nothing in common with the late Mrs. Caesar. To Napoleon, though, she was as a third-rate show to a country boy who had never before visited the theatre. She was divine. Barras saw, and he also saw a chance to rid himself of a burden, and at the same time to attach to himself a growingly useful friend. Barras persuaded Josephine to marry Napoleon, whom she did not even pretend to love, by saying that the young man had a great future. Then, as a wedding present, he gave Napoleon command of the ragged, mutinous army of Italy. Napoleon, after turning that army into such a fighting machine as the world had never before known, thrashed Italy and Austria, and came home the hero and idol of the hour, to find beyond all doubt or hope that Josephine was unfaithful to him. He ordered her out of his house. She wept. Her family wept. Everyone wept. Everyone pleaded. Napoleon shrugged his shoulders and let her stay. But ever thereafter he treated her with mere friendly tolerance. His love for her was stone dead, and he amused himself wherever amusement could be found. Also, when it suited his turn, in after years, he calmly divorced her. "Lefebvre," said Napoleon in Egypt, "what is Josephine doing at this moment?" "Weeping for your return," promptly babbled the future Duke of Danzig. "Lefebvre," soulfully returned Napoleon, "you're a fool or a liar, or both. She is riding a white horse in the Bois, in the worst kind of company she can find at such short notice." Men of rank and wit were choking Madame Recamier's salon to overflowing. She was the inaccessible goal of 100 Don Juan's ambitions. Grandees of the old and the new regime as well, aristocrats of the noblesse, who would not deign to visit the Tuileries while the Corsican adventurer held sway in that house of kings, all flocked to the Recamier home and vied with one another to do Jeanne honor. Her beauty, her siren charm, her snowy or frosty virtue, were the talk of France. What more natural than that Napoleon should seek out this new paragon, that sheer conceit as well as genuine love should make him burn to succeed where all the world had failed? Other women, women whose houses he could not have entered 7 years earlier, save as a dependent, were making fools of themselves over the man of destiny. He had but to throw the handkerchief for 100 frail beauties to scramble for its possession. Irresistible, perfect in power, and in the serene knowledge of that power, he deigned to make lazy love to Jeanne Recamier. She was not used to lazy love-making. She did not understand it, but took it for a mere new mannerism of the hyper-manneristic emperor. Her seeming indifference had the same effect on Napoleon as might a war campaign that promised grave obstacles. It turned his idle fancy to keen pursuit. Madame Recamier failed to be impressed. Napoleon, thinking he must be mistaken in the idea that any living woman could fail to be dazzled by his attentions, made his meaning quite clear, only to meet with a very good-humored but extremely definite rebuff from his charmer. It was past his understanding. He stooped to bribes, offering to put a big share of the state finances through the Recamier Bank, and with much pomp and ceremony announcing the appointment of Madame Recamier as one of the Empress Josephine's ladies-in-waiting. This was a master stroke, a tour de force, a knockout, anything you will. For fat and curved-nosed bankers throughout the empire were yelping for slices of the state finances, and the post of lady-in-waiting was one for which nearly any woman of the court would gladly have parted with all she no longer possessed. Then came a shock, a rough, jarring shock, a shock worthy to be administered by, instead of to, the Corsican himself. Madame Recamier coldly refused the glittering offers, declined to be a lady-in-waiting, and gave Napoleon to understand, in terms he could not mistake, that she wanted nothing from him except unadulterated absence. It was probably the emperor's one heart rebuff. In a burst of babyish fury, he, the ruler of France and the arbiter of Europe's fate, crawled so low as to seek revenge on a harmless woman. He first wrecked the Recamier Bank, driving old Recamier to the verge of ruin. Then he trumped up an asinine charge of treason, or lèse-majesté, or something equally absurd, against Jeanne, and on the strength of it he banished her from Paris. It was a revenge well worthy the eccentric who could rule or ruin half of Europe by a single convolution of his demigod brain, or could screech in impotent fury at a valet for getting the wrong part in his thin hair. From Paris went the Recamiers, the banker seeking gently to console his unhappy wife for the ruin she had so innocently wrought, and to build up for her, bit by bit, a new fortune to replace the lost one. Never by word or look did he blame her, and speedily he amassed enough money to supply her again with the luxuries she loved. To Lyons, the old home of both of them, they went, thence to Rome, and then to Naples. In Italy, Jeanne met once more her dearest woman friend, a ludicrously homely woman with the temper of a wet cat and a tongue sharp enough to shave with, a complete foil, mentally and facially, for her bosom friend Jeanne. This miracle of homeliness was Madame de Staël, author and futile conspirator. For exercising the latter accomplishment she had been banished, like Jeanne, from Paris. So ugly was Madame de Stael that when she once said to an ill-favored man, "You abuse the masculine prerogative of homeliness," her hearers laughed at her, not at her victim. In Italy, too, Jean met Prince Augustus of Prussia, Prince Royal and a man of distinction and wealth. They met at a reception. Madame Recamier and Madame de Stael were seated side by side on a sofa. After the introductions, Prince Augustus seated himself between them, remarking airily, "I find myself placed between wit and beauty." "And possessing neither," commented Madame de Stael with her wonted courtesy. The prince, from that inauspicious start, became the infatuated slave of Madame Recamier. He worshipped the ground she trod. He made no secret of his devotion. In those days the title of Prince Royal carried real weight, and the gulf between prince and commoner was well nigh unbridgeable. Love made Prince Augustus waive all this disparity. The fact that Madame Recamier was a mere commoner grew to mean nothing to him. At the risk of disgrace at home, and of possible loss of rank and fortune, the prince entreated Jean to divorce Recamier and to marry his royal-blooded self. It was a brilliant offer, one that 99 commoners out of 100 would have seized with alacrity, for it was not a morgantic union he proposed. He wanted to make Jean his princess. The prince went to Recamier and frankly stated his wishes. To his amaze, instead of challenging the wooer, Recamier at once agreed to let Jean get the divorce on any grounds she chose, or an annulment of their marriage, which would have been still simpler, and marry Prince Augustus. Always impersonal and adoring in his attitude towards Jean, Recamier now urged her to secure her own best interests by giving him up and becoming the prince's wife, a sacrifice far easier to understand in a father than in a husband. But Jean put aside the offer without a tremor of hesitation, turning her back on the wealth and title of a princess in order to remain with the bankrupt old commoner whom the world called her husband. For, again, physical reasons intervened. Lucien Bonaparte, one of the emperor's several brothers, was another ardent wooer. He shone in reflected glory as his brother's brother until he seemed quite royal. But to him, as to all the rest, Jean, after a wholly harmless and pleasant flirtation, gave a decided refusal. General Bernadotte, on a foreign mission for the emperor, sought her out. He was a military chief who had fought like a hero, and on whom court honors had since fallen thick. He sought, soldier fashion, to carry Jean's icy defenses by storm, only to fail as all had failed, and to go home grumbling that his majesty had done well to exile so unapproachable a beauty before she had a chance to drive every man in France mad with chagrin. Benjamin Constant, too, cunning statesman of the old school, loved her, and in his strange, unfathomable mind she found a certain fascination, the more so when she discovered that she could twist that mind to her own purposes. So, instead of dismissing Constant like the rest, she made it clear that she did not love him, and then kept him as a friend. Strong use did she make of that friendship, too, in revenging herself on Napoleon for banishing her. Constant's mighty, if tortuous, acts of statescraft just before and just after Napoleon's downfall have been laid to her influence. Another exile, General Moreau, Napoleon's oft-time rival in both war and love, now sought to win where his enemy had lost. And he failed. He was the same General Moreau who, a few years earlier, had paid court to Betty Jumel, and had given her as a love gift a huge gilt and prism chandelier which later hung in the Jumel mansion in New York. But he found Jean as cold as Betty had been kind, and in time he too departed hopeless. The next victim was no less a personage than the King of Naples. He was Murat, ex-tavern waiter, peerless cavalry leader, and husband of Napoleon's shrew sister, Caroline Bonaparte. The emperor, after conquering the separate Italian states, had placed his ex-waiter brother-in-law on the Neapolitan throne. When Jean reached Naples, Queen Caroline received her with open arms and invited her to be a guest at the palace. Murat's admiration for the lovely visitor was undisguisable, and though it has been denied by one biographer that Jean was responsible for his treason, almost at once after her arrival he began to intrigue with Napoleon's enemies. Form your own conclusions, as did folk of the time. Soon afterward, weakened by the idiotic Russian campaign, Napoleon was set upon by a host of foes. Men who had licked his boots fell over one another to join the alliance against him. The lion was wounded, and the dog pack was at his throat. As soon as Napoleon had been hustled off into exile, the Recamiers returned to Paris, as did practically all the army of people he had banished. The banker's fortune was looking up, and they could live in something of their old style there. Paris, in those first weeks of the Restoration, was as full of kings, emperors, princes, and dukes as a subway rush-hour train of newspaper readers. One could hardly walk a block without stumbling over a monarch, or a commander-in-chief, or a princeling. The heads of the allied armies were still there, strutting gallantly about. They would have run up a tree 2 years earlier, and bragging of Napoleon's fall. There was Alexander, Tsar of Russia, gigantic and bear-like, who had once cringed to Napoleon, then frozen and starved him in the Moscow campaign, and now was one of the chiefs of the alliance. There, too, was Blücher, who had tumbled off his horse at Waterloo, but who, nonetheless, had done more than is placed to his credit to win the victory that forever crushed Napoleon. It was he and his Prussians, not Wellington and the English, who really won Waterloo for the Allies. Other sovereigns, other generals there were, too, and foremost among them a long, lean Irishman with a bony face and a great hooked beak of a nose. He was Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, titular victor of Waterloo and man of the hour. The Duke of Wellington was not happily married. I think no retroactive libel law can attack me for saying this, for he himself made no secret of it, and he was far from being an exponent to stern British morality. Indeed, one object of his affections, Miss Jenkins, wrote of him to a friend, "It was all I could do to prevent his grace from throwing himself on his knees before me in sinful adulation." I fear he would have roused crass horror in the bosom of the mid-Victorian matron who, on seeing Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, exclaimed, "How different was Cleopatra's home life from that of our own gracious queen!" The Duke fell victim to Jean Recamier's charm. He, the official man of the hour, became a fixture at her salons, but for a very brief time. One day, when he was calling on her, a number of other guests being present, the Duke made some would-be witty remark about France. Jean chose to interpret his words as a slur on her beloved country. Roused for once from her wonted gentleness, she ordered Wellington out of her house. By the next day, all Paris knew that Madame Recamier had shown the omnipotent Duke of Wellington the door, and all Paris, which adored Jean and hated the English hero, went wild with delight. Jean's popularity from that moment was boundless. Soon afterward, Wellington found that stern duty called him, somewhat hastily, to London, whither, to his disgust, the story of his ejectment from Madame Récamier's salon had preceded him. Canova, the premier sculptor of his day, he who later paid such assiduous court to Elizabeth Patterson, fell in love with Jeanne. So indelibly was her wonder face stamped on his mind that, without her knowing it, he was able to make 2 busts of her. When the busts were done, Canova, who was constantly receiving and rejecting offers of fabulous sums to make portrait busts, showed her his labors of love. But Jeanne's beauty went hand in hand with vanity. She thought the busts over which he had toiled so happily did not do her justice, and without a word she turned away from the inspection and left the studio. The sharp blow to his pride was too much for Canova. He dropped her acquaintance forever, being perhaps the only one of Jeanne's adorers to break his allegiance to her before she gave the word. Récamier died. Jeanne, rich and still gloriously beautiful, received shoals of proposals. She rejected them all. She had at last met the love of her life. In the lives of all these superwomen, you will have noticed there was some one man who stood out supreme above all the host of lesser lovers, idolized, placed on a lofty pedestal, a wealth of devotion lavished on him. And so it was with Jeanne Récamier, although the affair from first to last was starkly platonic. She who had laughed at an emperor, who had rejected a prince's hand, who had turned the most famous man in Europe out of her house, lost her head and her heart to a cranky, bear-like author-adventurer, François Auguste de Chateaubriand. Your grandmother read and wept over his American novel, Atala. Chateaubriand was a heartbreaker. As a mere youth, his talent for transferring his allegiance with lightning speed from one woman to the next had won him the sobriquet L'Inconstant. He had traveled in the American wilderness, living among Indian tribes, had hobnobbed with George Washington, to whom he had brought letters of introduction, had been sent fleeing for his life from France during the Terror, had been a favorite of Napoleon's until the Corsican's tyranny disgusted him into turning conspirator. Of late years he had wandered aimlessly about Europe, making love and earning a scant living as a painter and writer. Sometimes broke, sometimes flush, sometimes acclaimed as a genius, sometimes chased as a political criminal, sometimes in palaces, sometimes in jail, Chateaubriand at length met Jeanne Récamier. From the first they loved each other. On neither side with it a crazily passionate adoration. Rather was it the full, calm devotion of mature hearts that seek safe harbor after many and battering storms. When Récamier died, Chateaubriand formally asked Jeanne's hand in marriage. She refused for reasons best known to herself and her physician, but they remained for all the rest of their lives faithful and utterly devoted lovers. Chateaubriand was uncouth, morbid, vain, bristling with a myriad foibles and faults. Jeanne, very gently and tactfully, undertook to cure him of these defects. With tender hands she gradually remolded his wayward, eccentric nature, stripping away much of its dross, bringing out its cleaner, nobler traits. "You have transformed my character," he wrote her. "I know nothing more beautiful, nor more good than you." When Récamier died in 1830, Jeanne was a little over 50. Chateaubriand was 62. A mature couple withal. Yet Jeanne looked scarce 30, and Chateaubriand was still in his late prime. Again and again he pleaded with Jeanne to marry him. Always she refused, just as she refused a host of others, even in her mature years. Indeed, she received and rejected a proposal of marriage when she was 70. The rest of this story is not especially romantic. Perhaps it may not interest you, for it has to do with the breaking up of things. The Recamier-Chateaubriand affair went on like an Indian summer for years. Then, as old age reached out for him, Chateaubriand's eccentricities cropped out afresh. He fell into a melancholy, shut himself away from the world that was at last growing to honor him, became a recluse, and would see no one except Madame Recamier. His melancholy deepened almost into mania. He had but one dream of life left in his heart, his love for Jeanne. To her he clung like a frightened child to a tender mother. Then, in its saddest form, old age laid its cold hand across beautiful Jeanne's orange-tinted eyes, and she became totally blind. Even in her blindness she was still lovely, and her soul lost none of its sweetness. Sightless, she still guarded and sought to amuse the cranky old man she so long had loved, bearing with his once imperious temper, which had now rotted into mere whining discontent, humoring his million whims, talking softly to him, in his brighter moments, about the gleaming past. The melancholy old man, lovingly tended and nursed and amused like a baby by the blind old woman who had been the reigning beauty of the world, lingered on for several years longer. When at last he died, Jeanne mourned him as never had she mourned Recamier or any other. Chateaubriand's death broke her heart. It broke, too, her last tie to earth, and within a few months she followed her lover to the grave. Thus, at 72, died Jean Recamier, virgin heartbreaker, whose very name was, for half a century, the synonym for absolute beauty and flawless purity. I know of no other superwoman whose character in any way resembles hers, which was perhaps more unlucky for the other superwoman than for the men who loved them. End of chapter 11. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 12 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 12. Lady Hamilton, patron saint of dime novel heroines. She was the mother of Gertrude the governess, the grande dame of Bertha, the beautiful sewing-machine girl, the earliest ancestrette of Ione, the pride of the mill. She was the impossibility that made possible the brain daughters of Laura Jean. She was the patron saint of all the dime novel heroines. She was the model, consciously or otherwise, probably otherwise, of all their authors. Because at a period when such things were undreamed of, even in fiction, she rose from nursemaid to title. Even in the books and plays of that age, the born serving wench did not marry the heir. In the highest literary flights, Bridget's crowning reward was to wed Luke, the gamekeeper, and become landlady of the Bibulous Goat or the Doodlethorpe Arms. Goldsmith was eyed askance for even making the heroine of She Stoops to Conquer pose momentarily as a lady's maid. Having thus tried to show how impossible was the happening, let me work up by degrees to the happening itself. She was a Lancashire lass, Emma Lyon by name. In mature years she dropped the Lyon and called herself Emma Hart. No one knows why. Lyon was not her name, neither was Hart for that matter. In fact, she had no name, her careless parents having failed to supply her with the legal right to one. Her father was a rural farmhand. He died while Emma was a baby. Her mother, an inn servant, moved later to Hawarden, and there a Mrs. Thomas hired Emma as nursemaid. This was in 1777. Emma was 13. She had already learned to read, a rare accomplishment in those days for the nameless brat of an inn drudge, and as nursemaid she greedily picked up stray morsels of her little charge's education, as well as the manners and language of her employers. She learned as quickly as a Chinaman. There is a hiatus in the records after Emma had served a year or so in the Thomas family. One biographer bridges the gap with a line of asterisks. Asterisks in biographies, as well as in sex problem fiction, may indicate either a lapse of time or a lapse of morals. Emma reappeared from the asterisk cloud in London, where she was nursemaid in the house of a Dr. Budd, one of the physicians at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Dr. Budd's housemaid at that time, by the way, later became a Drury Lane star under the name of Mrs. Powell. And in that bright after-day, she and the even more apotheosized Emma renewed their below-stairs friendship. For some reason, Emma left Dr. Budd's service rather suddenly, and found a job as helper in the shop of a St. James Market mercer. She was 16, and she was gloriously beautiful. Her figure was superb. Already she had a subtle charm of her own, which drew to her feet crowds of footmen, shop-boys, apprentices, and such small deer. There is no record that they one and all were sent away disconsolate. During her brief career as helper to the St. James Market mercer, Emma chanced to attract the notice of a woman of quality who one day entered the shop, and forthwith she was hired as lady's maid. The girl had picked up a smattering of education. She had scraped from her pink tongue the rough Lancashire burr. She had learned to speak correctly, to ape the behavior of the solid folk whose servant she had been. Now, from her new employer, she was to learn at first hand how people in the world of fashion comported themselves, and, chameleon-like, she took on the color of her gay surroundings. Soon she could lisp such choice and fashionable expletives as "scrape me raw" and "oh, lay me bleedin'," and could talk and walk and posture as did her mistress. Trashy novels by the dozen fell into her hands from her mistress's table. Emma devoured them gluttonously and absorbed their precepts as the human system absorbs alcohol fumes. Please don't for one moment get the idea that there was anything profitable to a young girl in the novels of the latter 18th century. Perhaps you have in mind such dreary, sterling works as Pamela, Clarissa Harlowe, Sir Charles Grandison, and others that were crammed into your miserably protesting brain in the literature courses. Those were the rare, the very rare exceptions to a large and lurid list which included such choice classics as Moll Flanders, Roxana, both of them by the same Defoe who wrote Robinson Crusoe, and whose other novels would send a present-day publisher to State's prison, Peregrine Pickle, Fanny Hill, The Delicate Distress, Roderick Random, and the rest of a rank-flavored multitude. Emma reveled in the joys of the local circulating library, too, one of those places that loaned books of a sort to cause even the kindly Sheridan to thunder his famous dictum, "A circulating library in a town is an evergreen tree of diabolical knowledge. It blossoms through the year, and, depend on't, they who are so fond of handling the leaves will long for the fruit at last." Much reading filled Emma with wonderful new ideas of life. Incidentally, it made her neglect her work, and she was discharged. Her next step was to become barmaid in a tavern.
While she was there, a young admirer of hers was seized by the Navy press gang. Emma went to the captain of the ship to beg for her swain's release. The captain was John Willett Payne, afterward a rear admiral. Payne granted the lovely girl's plea. He not only gave her what she asked, but his own admiration as well. Her story as a heart-winner had begun. In fiction, the gallant captain would soon have tired of his lively sweetheart and cast her aside, but Emma was not a lowly sweetheart. She was a superwoman. She showed how much stranger than fiction truth may be by deserting Payne for a richer man. First, however, she had wheedled the captain into hiring tutors and music masters for her, and she profited vastly by their teachings. Her new flame was a sporting baronet, Sir Harry Featherstone of Up Park, Sussex. Sir Harry was an all-around athlete and a reckless horseman. He taught Emma to ride, a beggar on horseback, and she became the most daring equestrienne of the century. He taught her to spend money, too, and so splendidly did she learn her lesson that inside of a year Sir Harry was bankrupt. Perhaps all rats do not leave a sinking ship, but for very good reasons one never hears anything further of the rats that don't. The rat that wishes to continue his career wastes no time in joining the exodus. And Emma Lyon did not disdain to take example from the humble rodent. There seemed no good reason for remaining longer at the side of the bankrupt baronet, to add to his cares and expenses, so, with womanly consideration, she left him. She was alone in the world once more, without a shilling or a friend, equipped with education, accomplishments, wondrous beauty and charm, but with no immediate market for those commodities. It was the black hour that comes least once into the life of every adventuress. And in this time of need she fell in with a beauty-culture quack, Graham by name. Graham had devised a rejuvenation medicine. From Dr. Faustus down, the world has feverishly, piteously seized on every nostrum advertised as a means of exchanging age for youth, and he vowed that it would make its users not only young again, but maddeningly beautiful. As an example of after-using, Graham exhibited Emma Lyon, who, he said, had once been old and ugly, and who, by a course of his elixir, had become youthful and glorious. He called his medicine megalanthropogenesis. Women who heard his lecture took one look at Emma and then bought out Graham's ready supply of the stuff. The charlatan was an artist in gaining his effects, as witness a report of the exhibition in which Emma posed. He had contrived a bed of Apollo, or celestial bed, on which, in a delicately colored light, this exquisitely beautiful woman, nearly naked, was gradually unveiled, to soft, soft music, as Hygeia, goddess of health. Presumably no effort was made by any 18th-century Comstock to suppress this show, and all London flocked and thronged and jostled to behold it. Apart from the normal crowd of idlers, came painters and sculptors to gaze in delight on the perfect face and form revealed through the shimmer of rose-colored light. And foremost of these artists was a freakish genius toward whom was slowly creeping the insanity that a few years later was to claim him, and whose stealthy approach he was even then watching with horror. He was George Romney, who, with Sir Joshua Reynolds, divided the homage of England's art world. Romney had come to stare at Emma. He remained to worship. He engaged her as his model, and soon or late painted no less than 39 pictures of her. "I call her the Divine Lady," he once wrote, "for I think she is superior to all womankind." The black hour was past. Emma Lyon's fortune and fame were secure. Thanks to Romney, she was the best advertised beauty on earth. Conquests came thick and fast, not treading on one another's heels, but racing abreast. Soon, out of the ruck and forging far ahead, appeared Charles Francis Greville, wit, art connoisseur, and nephew and heir of the famed antiquary diplomat Sir William Hamilton. Greville cut out all rivals, Romney among the rest, and won Emma for his own. Theirs was an odd love affair, for here, too, Emma gave full rein to her craving for education, and she showed for the first time just why she was so eager to be highly educated. It was not for mere learning's sake, but to enhance the charm that gave her a hold over men. She cared nothing for any but the showy accomplishments. She already had a fair groundwork in English and ordinary school studies. She made Greville get her the best teachers in singing, in dancing, in acting. Perhaps she looked forward to a stage triumph, but more likely to outshining the colorless bread-and-butter women of her day. Never did pupil better repay the pains of her teachers. Her voice presently rivaled that of many a prima donna. Her dancing was a delight. It was she who conceived the celebrated shawl dance that was the rage throughout Europe for years thereafter, and that still is used in very slightly modified form by première danseuses. But acting was Emma's forte. Says a contemporary writer, "With a common piece of stuff, she could so arrange and clothe herself as to offer the most appropriate representations of a Jewess, a Roman matron, a Helen, Penelope, or Aspasia. No character seemed foreign to her, and the grace she was in the habit of displaying under such representations excited the admiration of all who were fortunate enough to be present on such occasions. Siddons could not surpass the grandeur of her style, or O'Neill be more melting in the utterance of deep pathos." In this heyday of her prosperity, Emma hunted up her aged and disreputable mother, bestowed on her the name Mrs. Cadogan, and settled a rich pension on her. At about the same time, too, Emma bade a cheery farewell to the serviceable name of Lyon, and took to calling herself Emma Hart. Then Greville went broke. In his new-found poverty, he hit on a plan of life foreign to all his old ideas. He decided to ask his rich old uncle, Sir William Hamilton, to pay his debts and settle a little annuity on him. With his sum as a means of livelihood, he intended to marry Emma, and with her and their 3 children settle down in some cheap suburb. How this appealed to Emma, history forgets to say. Judging by both past and future, it is not unjust to suppose that she may have been making ready once more to emulate the ship-deserting rat. But this time she did not need to. The ship was about to desert her, for a consideration. Greville, full of his new hopes, went to Sir William Hamilton and laid the plan before him. His nephew's derelictions from the straight and narrow path had long distressed the virtuous old diplomat, and in Greville's financial troubles, Sir William thought he saw a fine chance to break off his nephew's discreditable affair with Emma. He offered to set Greville on his feet again if that luckless youth would drop Emma's acquaintance. The enamoured Greville refused. Sir William insisted, raising his offer of financial aid, and pointing out, with tearful eloquence, the family disgrace that a marriage to a woman of Emma's dissolute character must cause. It was all quite like a scene from a modern problem play. But fate, her tongue in her cheek, was preparing to put a twist on the end of the scene worthy of the most cynical French vaudeville writer. Greville resented his uncle's rash judgment of his adored Emma, and begged him to come and see her for himself, hoping that Emma's wonder charm might soften the old man's virtue-encrusted heart. Reluctantly, Sir William consented to one brief interview with the wicked siren. At sight of Emma, Sir William's heart melted to mushiness. He fell crazily in love with the woman he had come to dispossess. There was another long and stormy scene between uncle and nephew, after which Greville, for an enormous lump sum, transferred to Sir William Hamilton all right and title and goodwill to the adorable Emma Hart. And Sir William and Emma departed thence, arm in arm, leaving Greville a sadder but a richer man. What became of the three children I don't know. By the way, Emma had taught them to call her aunt, not mother. Will you let me quote a deadly dry line or two from an encyclopedia to prove to you how important a personage Sir William was, and how true is the axiom about no fool like an old fool? Hamilton, Sir William, British diplomatist and antiquary, 1730 to 1803, student of art, philosophy, and literature. From 1764 to 1800, English ambassador to the court of Naples, trustee of British Museum, fellow of the Royal Society, vice president of the Society of Antiquaries, distinguished member of the Dilettante Club, author of several books. Sir Joshua Reynolds, his intimate friend, painted his portrait, which hangs in the National Gallery. Sir William, who was home on leave of absence when he met Emma, took her back with him to Italy. But before they sailed, she had prevailed on him to marry her. It was easy. He was old. The marriage was kept secret until, in 1791, she led her husband back to England on another leave of absence, and up to the altar of St. George's Church, where, on September 6 of that year, they were married all over again, this time with every atom of publicity Emma could compass. She was then 27, her husband was 61. In state, they returned to the court of Naples, the most corrupt, licentious, false, utterly abominable court in all Europe. If you will glance at the annals of the courts of that period, you will find this statement is as true as it is sweeping. On her earlier visit, as the supposed brevet bride of the ambassador, Emma had been warmly received by Marie Caroline, Queen of Naples and sister to Marie Antoinette of France. Emma and Marie Caroline were kindred spirits, which is perhaps the unkindest thing I could say about either of them, and they quickly formed a lasting friendship for each other. Emma was glad to get back to Naples. Apart from her marriage, her visit to England had not been a success. A certain element in London society, attracted by her beauty, her voice, and her talent as an actress, had taken her up, but Queen Charlotte had refused her a presentation at the British court, and the more reputable element of the nobility had followed royal example and given her a wide berth. English society under George III was severely respectable, at least in the matter of externals, a quality it was soon to mislay under George IV. Hence Emma's joy at returning to a court where respectability was a term to be found only in the dictionary. The King of Naples was a fool. His wife was the little kingdom's ruler. Emma, Lady Hamilton, became her chief adviser. Writes one historian, "It is not too much to say of these two women that for years they wielded the destinies of Naples, and seriously affected the character of the wars that ended with the peace of Europe in 1815, when both were dead. Both were endowed with powers of mind far above the average of their sex. Both exhibited energy and understanding that inspired them to bold and decisive, if not always laudable, deeds. Both were as remarkable for their personal beauty as for their self-reliance, their knowledge of men, and their determination to make the most of their information. To say that Marie Caroline loved Lady Hamilton is to misstate a fact. There was no love in the royal composition, but her ungovernable and undying hatred of the French inclined her, no doubt, in the first instance toward the wife of the English ambassador, and the subsequent devotion of the favorite secured an attachment that is confessed and reiterated through whole pages of a vehement and overstrained correspondence. Naples just then was between two fires. There was fear of a French invasion, which arrived on schedule time, and there was also danger that England would ruin Neapolitan commerce. Emma's white hands were at once plunged wrist-deep into the political dough, and a sorry mess she proceeded to make of it. For example, the King of Spain wrote a confidential letter to his brother, the King of Naples, accusing the English government of all sorts of public and private crimes, and telling of Spain's secret alliance with France. The king showed it to his wife, who in turn showed it to Lady Hamilton. Emma stole and secretly sent the letter to the British cabinet. The result was a bloody war between England and Spain. About 2 years after Emma's marriage, an English warship, the Agamemnon, touched at Naples, and her captain called to pay his respects to the British ambassador and to deliver a letter from the admiral of the Mediterranean fleet. After a few minutes' talk with the captain, Sir William insisted that the latter should meet Lady Hamilton. He bustled into the drawing-room to prepare Emma for the visitor's arrival, saying excitedly to her, "I am bringing you a little man who cannot boast of being very handsome, but who, I pronounce, will one day astonish the world. I know it from the very words of conversation I have had with him." On the heels of Sir William's announcement, the little man came into the room. At first glance, he scarcely seemed to justify Hamilton's enthusiasm. He was clad in a full-laced uniform. His lank, unpowdered hair was tied in a stiff Hessian queue of extraordinary length. Old-fashioned, flaring waistcoat flaps added to the general oddity of his figure. Sir William introduced him as Captain Horatio Nelson. Lady Hamilton lavished on the queer guest no especial cordiality. It is not known that she gave him a second thought. Nelson, little more impressed by the Superwoman, wrote to his wife in England an account of the call, saying of Lady Hamilton, whose story of course he and everybody knew, "She is a young woman of amiable manners, who does honor to the station to which she has been raised." Yet Nelson had unwittingly met the woman who was to tarnish the pure glory of his fame. And Emma had met the man but for whom she would today be forgotten. So little does fate forecast her dramas that, at the first meeting, neither of the two immortal lovers seems to have felt any attraction for the other. Not for 5 busy years did Nelson and Emma Hamilton see each other again. Then Nelson came back to Naples, this time in triumph, a world-renowned hero, the champion of the seas, Britain's idol. He had become an admiral, a peer of England, a scourge of his country's foes. Back to Naples he came. Part of him, not all, for victorious warfare had set cruel marks on him. He had left his right eye at Calvi in 1794, and his right arm at Teneriffe in 1797. He was more odd-looking than ever, but he was an acclaimed hero, and Naples in general, and Emma Hamilton in particular, welcomed him with rapture. He was in search of the French fleet, and he wanted the King of Naples to let him re-provision his ships in the Neapolitan harbor. Now, France and Naples just then happened to be at peace, and by their treaty No more than 2 English warships at a time could enter any Neapolitan or Sicilian port. The King's Council declared the treaty must stand. Lady Hamilton decided otherwise. She used all her power with the Queen to have the treaty set aside. As a result, Marie Caroline issued an order directing all governors of the 2 Sicilies to water, victual, and aid Nelson's fleet. This order made it possible for Nelson to go forth reprovisioned and to crush the French in the Battle of the Nile. In the first rumor of this battle that reached Naples, Nelson was reported killed. Soon afterward he appeared alive and well in the harbor. Here is his letter to his wife telling how Lady Hamilton received him on his return. Nelson, by the way, had been married for nearly 12 years. He and his wife were devoted to each other. Judging from this letter, he was lamentably ignorant of women, or was incredibly sure of Lady Nelson's love and trust, or else his courage was greater than that of mortal husband. He wrote, "Sir William and Lady Hamilton came out to sea to meet me. They, my most respectable friends, had nearly been laid up and seriously ill, first from anxiety and then from joy. It was imprudently told Lady Hamilton in a moment that I was alive, and the effect was like a shot. She fell apparently dead, and is not yet perfectly recovered from severe bruises. Alongside came my honored friends. The scene in the boat was terribly affecting. Up flew her ladyship, and exclaiming, 'Oh God, is it possible?' she fell into my arms more dead than alive. Tears, however, soon set matters to rights, when alongside came the king. I hope some day to have the pleasure of introducing you to Lady Hamilton. She is one of the very best women in the world. She is an honor to her sex. Her kindness, with Sir William's, to me is more than I can express. I am in their house, and I may tell you it required all the kindness of my friends to set me up. Lady Hamilton intends writing to you. May God Almighty bless you, and give us in due time a happy meeting." France sought revenge for the help given to Nelson's fleet, and declared war on Naples. The Neapolitans, in fury at being dragged into such a needless conflict, rose against their dear king and adored queen, especially against their adored queen, and threatened to kill them. By Lady Hamilton's aid, the royal family reached Nelson's flagship and took refuge there from the mob. Sir William and Lady Hamilton went along. The populace looted the British embassy and stole everything of value Sir William owned, about $195,000 worth of property in all. Thus, Hamilton was the third man who had lost a fortune through Emma. Meanwhile, Nelson had sailed to Palermo, taking the fugitives along. There he made his home with the Hamiltons, and scandal awoke even in that easygoing crowd. Nor did the scandal die down to any appreciable extent on the birth of Lady Hamilton's daughter Horatia a year or so later. Sir William's conduct in the matter is still a puzzle. He felt, or professed to feel, that there was no occasion for jealousy, and so for a long time the trio shared the same house. One of the courtiers who had fled with the king and queen to Palermo was Prince Caraccioli, Nelson's close friend and Lady Hamilton's bitter enemy. Caraccioli asked leave to go back to Naples to look after his endangered property. As soon as he reached the city, he threw in his lot with the rebels and was made admiral of their navy. Presently, by the aid of England's fleet, the royal family returned. The rebellion was put down, and the king and queen were once more seated firmly on their thrones. The rebel leaders were seized and brought to trial. Nelson is said to have promised immunity to Caraccioli if he would surrender. Relying on his friend's pledge, Caraccioli surrendered. At Emma's request, Nelson had the over-trustful man hanged from the yardarm of his own flagship. This is the darkest smear on Nelson's character, a smear that even his most blatant admirers have never been able to wipe away. It is not in keeping with anything else in his life, but by this time he belonged to Lady Hamilton, body and soul. She, by the way, had managed to acquire from her friend the Queen of Naples a nice tendency toward bloodthirstiness, as witness the following sweet anecdote by Prynne Lockhart Gordon, who tells of dining with the Hamiltons at Palermo in company with a Turkish officer. In the course of conversation, the officer boasted that with the sword he wore he had put to death a number of French prisoners. "Look," he said, "there is their blood remaining on it." When the speech was translated to her, Lady Hamilton's eyes beamed with delight. "Oh, let me see the sword that did the glorious deed!" she exclaimed. Taking the sword in her hands, which were covered with jewels, she looked at it, then kissed the encrusted blood on the blade, and passed it on to Nelson. Only one who was a witness to the spectacle can imagine how disgusting it was. Enshrined once more at Naples, hailed as saviour of the realm, acclaimed for her share in the Nile victory, the confidante of royalty, it would be pleasant to say good-bye here to Emma Lyon, ex-nursemaid, ex-barmaid, ex-lady's maid, nameless offspring of a Lancashire inn-slavey. It was the climax of a wonderful life, but there was anticlimax aplenty to follow. Nelson went home to England to receive the plaudits of his fellow countrymen and to settle accounts with his wife. Home, too, came the Hamiltons, Sir William having been recalled. Lady Nelson was not at the dock to meet her hero husband. Bad news travelled fast, even before we boosted it along by wire and then by wireless. Lady Nelson had heard, and Lady Nelson was waiting at home. Thither, blithely enough, fared the man in whose praise a million Englishmen were cheering themselves hoarse, and in whose silver-buckled shoes perhaps no married Englishman would just then have cared or dared to stand. But Nelson was a hero. He went home. I once had a collie puppy that had never chanced to be at close quarters with a cat. I was privileged to see him when he made his first gleefully fearless attack upon one, ignorant of the potential anguish tucked away behind a feline's velvety paws. Somehow, with no disrespect to a great man, I always think of that poor, about-to-be disillusioned puppy when I try to visualize the picture of Nelson's homecoming. Just what happened, no one knows, but whatever it was, it did not teach Nelson the wisdom of husbandly reticence, for a few weeks later he remarked at breakfast, "I have just received another letter from dear Lady Hamilton." "I am sick of hearing of dear Lady Hamilton," flared the long-suffering wife. "You can choose between us. You must give up her or me." "Take care, Fanny," warned Nelson. "I love you dearly, but I cannot forget all I owe to dear Lady Hamilton." "This is the end, then," announced Lady Nelson, and she left the house. Only once again did she and her husband meet. Nelson cast off all pretence at concealment after his wife left him. His affair with Lady Hamilton became public property. Their daughter, Horatia, was openly acclaimed by him as his heiress. The English were in a quandary. They loved Nelson. They hated the woman who had dragged his name into the filth. They could not snub her without making him unhappy. They could not honor him without causing her to shine by reflected glory. It was unpleasant all around. In 1805, the deadlock was broken. Nelson was again to fight the French. He told Lady Hamilton and many others that this campaign was to end in his death. He ordered his coffin made ready for him. Then he sailed against the French fleet, met it off Cape Trafalgar, and annihilated it. In the thick of the fight, a musket ball gave him his death wound. He was carried below, and there, the battle raging around him, he laboriously wrote a codicil to his will, entreating his king and country to repay his services by settling a pension on Lady Hamilton. Then to his next in command he panted, "I am going fast. Come nearer. Pray let my dear Lady Hamilton have my hair and all other things belonging to me. Take care of my dear Lady Hamilton. Poor Lady Hamilton. Thank God I have done my duty." And so he died, this knightly little demigod, true lover, false husband, who had fouled his snowy escutcheon for a worthless woman. Now comes the inevitable anticlimax. All England turned with loathing from Lady Hamilton. Her husband was dead. Lovers stood aloof. Folk who had received her for Nelson's sake barred their doors against her. She had followed the popular custom of living in luxury on nothing a year. Now her creditors swarmed upon her. Her house was sold for debt. Next, she lived in Bond Street lodgings, growing poorer day by day until she was condemned to the debtors' prison. A kind-hearted, or hopeful, alderman bought her out of jail. A former coachman of hers, whose wages were still unpaid, threatened her with arrest for debt. She fled to Calais. There she lived in an attic, saved from absolute starvation by a fellow Englishwoman, a Mrs. Hunter. Her youth and charm had fled. The power that had lured Nelson and Greville and Hamilton to ruin was gone. In 1815 she died. She was buried in a pine box with an old black silk petticoat for a pall. No clergyman could be found to take charge of her funeral. So the burial service was read by a fellow debt exile, a half-pay Irish army captain. One wonders, perhaps morbidly, if Nelson's possible punishment in another world might not have been the knowledge of what befell his dear Lady Hamilton in her latter days. End of chapter 12. Recording by Linda Johnson. End of Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune.